The first time Severian heard the story, it was told the way people tell stories when they're afraid of their own excitement. It was late, and the lamps had sunk into that smoky patience they kept when no one dared trim them. The room was a borrowed room in Nicomedia, one of those civic chambers that smelled of old cedar and damp stone, and the men inside it spoke as if walls had ears. Outside, the sea breathed against the harbor, and the masts clicked softly like bones. A young clerk named Marcellus leaned in, his voice almost playful. "They say he saw it," he murmured, "in the sky. Not in a dream, not in a temple, in the open day." Severian did not look up from his cup. He let the wine rest on his tongue, as if he might taste the lie before it reached his mind. "In the sky," Severian repeated, gently, as if correcting a student. "The sky is full of things, birds, weather, the occasional omen, if the imagination is hungry enough." Marcellus smiled too quickly. That smile was the tell. It was not joy. It was self-protection. It was before the battle, Marcellus went on, before he turned and marched like a man who had already been forgiven. "They say he ordered a new sign painted on shields." Severian's fingers tightened around the cup. It was a small gesture, almost nothing, yet he felt it as a betrayal of his own composure. He had spent years training his body to be the obedient animal that carried his mind. He had spent years teaching others that the soul must not be enslaved by rumor. Still, he had heard other whispers, not only from clerks, from soldiers with scarred hands who had no talent for invention, from a court physician who swore he had seen Constantine wake from sleep, as if jolted out of another world, his face bright with terror and certainty, from a bishop's deacon, newly bold, who spoke of the emperor as if he were already a kind of catechumen, a learner under God. Severian set the cup down. He listened to the creak of the building, the minute settling of beams, the sigh of wind pressing through the shutters. A measured voice inside him began to inventory the situation, like a man counting coins in the dark. If Constantine had chosen a god, then all gods would be dragged into the choice. And if Constantine had chosen the Christian God, then the empire was about to discover what happens when a faith accustomed to secrecy acquires the machinery of law. He glanced at Marcellus. The clerk's ink-stained fingers toyed with the edge of his sleeve. He was young enough to imagine the future as a staircase, each step higher than the last. Severian, older, had learned to see the future as a corridor with doors on both sides, and behind some of those doors there was only smoke. "That sign," Severian said at last. "Did you see it?" Marcellus shook his head. "I heard." "From whom?" Marcellus hesitated. The names were the danger. Then he said, softly, "From someone who thinks this is the end of fear." Severian almost laughed. He did not, because laughter in the wrong place was an invitation to be misunderstood. "The end of fear," he repeated, as if fear were a policy the emperor could repeal. He rose and moved to the window. The city's night lay below, folded into darkness, punctured by a few stubborn lights. Nicomedia was proud and tired. It had served emperors before. It would serve emperors again. A philosopher could be forgiven for believing cities were immortal. Yet he remembered the words of Plotinus, the way his teacher had once spoken of human affairs as theater, of the outer man as a puppet who mistakes the play for the self. Severian had found comfort in that when he was young. He had thought it a kind of mercy. But mercy, he had learned, can harden into contempt. Contempt is easy when other people's lives are scenery. A knock came at the door. Not the casual knock of a friend, not the timid knock of a petitioner. This was a knock that assumed obedience. Marcellus went pale and stepped back as if the sound had touched him. The door opened, and a man in a plain cloak entered with the controlled posture of someone who served power without needing to boast of it. He was not armed, which was the first warning. Real authority did not rattle. He bowed, just enough to be polite, not enough to be submissive. "Severian of Tyre," he said. Severian inclined his head. "You have the advantage of me. My name is Julius," the man replied. "I manage certain correspondences." That phrase, certain correspondences, was a small gate into a large walled garden. It could mean letters. It could mean surveillance. It could mean the private scaffolding by which public decisions were raised. Julius looked around the room, at the small gathering of men who suddenly wished they had chosen another tavern, another night. Then Julius's gaze returned to Severian, steady as a scale. "You were recommended," Julius said. as a man who understands how to speak to educated minds without insulting them. Severian felt the trap in the compliment. He kept his face calm. Educated minds, Severian said, are often insulted by truth. Julius did not smile. Truth has many outfits. We are looking for one that can be worn at court. The room had grown quieter. Even the harbor sounds seemed to fall away. Severian could hear his own breath, the soft rasp of it, the animal insistence of life. What does the court want with a philosopher? Severian asked. In a time when soldiers decide history. Julius's eyes flickered. Soldiers win battles. Emperors win futures. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, though no one in the room dared move. There is a change, Julius said. You have heard of it. I won't ask you to pretend you have not. Severian thought of the rumors, the painted shields, the sky story told in frightened excitement. He thought of the Christians, once treated as stubborn outsiders, now standing a little straighter when they walked past a magistrate's door. He thought of how quickly the world could learn new manners. A change, Severian said. Yes, Julius replied, and changes require interpretation. The old language does not fit. The new language is not yet trusted. We need men who can build bridges before the river takes them. Severian felt a coldness in his stomach. It was not fear exactly. It was recognition. He had spent his life building bridges inside the self, teaching students to cross from sensation to thought, from thought to something stiller. Now the empire wanted a bridge between religions, between cities, between yesterday and tomorrow. And what, Severian asked, is the toll for crossing this bridge? Julius watched him. Service, Julius said, discretion, and the ability to endure being misunderstood by both sides. Severian turned his head slightly, looking again through the window at the scattered lights. Civilization, he thought, was always being misunderstood by the people living inside it. Later generations drew clean lines. The living never had that luxury. What exactly, Severian said, does Constantine want? Julius paused, and in that pause Severian felt something like the first crack of thunder in summer heat. He wants unity, Julius said. He believes this God offers it. He believes the Christians are members of one another in a way the old cults never managed to be. He believes perhaps that an empire held together by fear can be held together better by belonging. Marcellus made a sound, a small, involuntary breath. Severian did not move. He could feel the room waiting for his response, as if his words might settle the argument before it began. Unity, belonging, words that had always sounded like philosophy when spoken in lecture halls. Now they sounded like policy. Severian thought of the pagan circles he knew, the cultivated men who argued about the one and the good, who spoke of daemons as intermediaries, the air full of unseen ranks and powers. He thought of how those circles could be brilliant, and yet brittle, how they could agree on the beauty of an idea, and still despise the neighbor who worshipped differently. He thought of Christian assemblies and houses, their strange confidence, their stubborn care for one another, the way a poor widow could speak to a senator's wife, as if both were equal in the only way that mattered. He did not call it inferior. He did not call it inevitable. He only felt the pull of it, like the sea pulling at a ship that insists it belongs to the shore. And if I refuse, Severian asked. Julius's expression softened, just barely. It was the softness of a man who had seen many refusals and learned what they cost. Then you will continue to teach, Julius said, until the day you discover your students have stopped coming, not because they hate you, because the world has found another teacher. Severian closed his eyes for a heartbeat. He saw a future where temples still stood but sounded hollow, where statues remained but the prayers changed, where philosophers learned to speak in a new grammar of authority. He saw bishops sitting in chairs that used to belong to magistrates. He saw books copied by hands that once copied Homer. He saw the old gods not slain, but sidelined, like elderly relatives whose stories no longer set the rules of the house. When he opened his eyes, Julius was still there, waiting, calm as a verdict. Come tomorrow, Julius said. There will be a small gathering. Men who still believe the old world can be carried into the new, without breaking. And men who believe the old world deserves to break. Constantine will not attend. That is not his way, but his shadow will. Severian felt the first destabilization settle into him, not as panic, but as a slow turning of the inner compass. A philosopher had always assumed the world might change. He had not expected to be invited to help it change him. He nodded once. Julius bowed again, just enough, and left as quietly as he had entered. Marcellus stared at Severian as if he had just watched his teacher step onto a ship. "Will you go?" Marcellus whispered. Severian looked down at his hands, at the faint tremor he could not entirely command. "Yes," he said. And, in the silence that followed, he understood the real question had already begun to tighten around his life. Not whether Christianity was inferior, but whether the mind, standing alone, could survive an empire that had chosen its soul. Severian did not sleep well. He lay on his narrow bed with the window open to the sea air, and the night moved through the room in slow breaths. Somewhere in the city, a dog barked once, then thought better of it. A drunk sang a fragment of an old marching song, the tune collapsing like wet paper. The lamps in the street below thinned and flared as the wind worried them. Nothing dramatic happened, yet Severian felt the world tilting. The way you can feel a ship shift before the harbor ropes are cut. He kept returning to Julius's last phrase. Constantine will not attend, but his shadow will. A shadow could mean a law not yet published. A shadow could mean a favored official. A shadow could mean a bishop whose words would soon carry the weight of a governor. In the new atmosphere, a shadow was sometimes more decisive than a man. At dawn he washed, dressed in his plain philosopher's cloak, and ate a little bread he did not taste. When he stepped into the street, the city was waking with the careful energy of a place that served an emperor. Traders were already arguing in the market, their voices low but sharp. A group of soldiers passed, their armor dull in the early light, their faces unreadable. Two women in dark veils moved quickly, heads bowed, and Severian thought, without any proof, that they were Christians. It was not the veils, it was the way they walked, as if their destination mattered more than the eyes upon them. Julius had said, "Come tomorrow," and so Severian went to the address he had been given, a villa just beyond the busier streets, where the gardens were kept too neatly for a private man. The gate admitted him at once, without questions, which meant his name had already been spoken inside. The first room was cool and spare. No statues, no household gods in niches, no garlands. The walls were bare plaster, faintly damp. It was the kind of room that could be redefined quickly, made to serve any purpose. Severian felt a small chill at that. The old world loved its objects. The new world, it seemed, loved its emptiness. Julius was there, standing with a tablet in his hand, as if he were about to take minutes. He nodded once, and led Severian deeper into the house, through a corridor that smelled of oil and fresh-cut reeds, to a chamber where a half-dozen men had gathered. They were arranged loosely, as if someone had instructed them not to appear arranged. Yet Severian could read the invisible order. The man with the fine wool cloak and thin mouth was a senator from some eastern city, accustomed to commanding with fatigue. Accustomed to commanding with fatigue. The broad-shouldered man near the window carried himself like a tribune who had learned how to become invisible in rooms where generals spoke. Two others were clearly educated, their hands soft, their eyes alert, men who lived in words. And then there was the last figure, seated, almost still. He wore no special clothing. His hair was cut close. His face had the long seriousness of someone used to listening to petitions. Not a philosopher's face, Severian thought, not a soldier's, a judge's. When Julius introduced him, he used a name Severian recognized. Osius, not a bishop of Nicomedia, but a bishop from the western provinces, brought into Constantine's confidence. Severian had heard the name in passing, spoken by Christians with a kind of relieved reverence, as if this man made the emperor's interest feel real, not merely opportunistic. Osius rose, offering Severian a courtesy that was not quite deference, and not quite equality. "Teacher," Osius said. Severian felt the word land on him oddly. Teacher was what his students called him, sometimes mockingly, sometimes with genuine hunger. Hearing it from a bishop was like hearing an old melody played on a new instrument. "I am not sure I am welcome," Severian replied. Osius's expression did not change much, but Severian sensed a faint humor behind it, restrained. "Welcome is a feeling," the bishop said. "We are here for necessity." The senator cleared his throat, irritated by this softness. "Let us be plain," the senator said. "The court is changing. We all know it. Christians have become bold enough to request offices they would not have dared look at 10 years ago. Bishops are consulted in disputes that used to belong to magistrates. And the emperor," he paused, as if naming Constantine's spiritual life was like naming a disease. The emperor has preferences. Severian watched the tribune by the window. The soldier's gaze stayed on the garden outside, as if he preferred to imagine this talk was about weather. One of the educated men, a rhetorician from Bithynia, spoke with a careful smile. "Not yet," the senator snapped. Severian listened, and beneath the words he heard the deeper music of an age taught by fear. Fear did not always shout. Sometimes it dressed itself in reason and called itself prudence. Osius lifted a hand, not commanding, simply claiming space. "The emperor believes," he said, "that the Christian God has shown him favor. He believes that what he has received should be honored." "Honor is a temple," the senator said. "Honor is sacrifice. Would he build a church in every city and call it honor?" Osius did not argue the point. That restraint unsettled Severian more than any zeal would have. A zealous man could be dismissed as emotional. A restrained man had already calculated. "We do not speak today," Osius said, "about temples. We speak about peace." The rhetorician laughed softly, then checked himself as if laughter were suddenly risky. "Peace," he repeated. A Christian word now. Osius's eyes turned toward Severian. There was no hostility in them, only an intense seriousness. "You know the philosophers," Osius said. "You know what they fear. Tell us, Severian of Tyre, what do they say in private when they speak of this change?" Severian felt every face pivot toward him. For a moment he wanted to say nothing, to retreat into the safe purity of silence. But Julius had promised him misunderstanding from both sides. This, he thought, was the toll beginning. "They say," Severian began, "that Christianity is for the untrained. They say it is a doctrine of fishermen, made into a doctrine of emperors. They say its stories are crude, its logic thin, its God too jealous, too absolute, too eager to erase the old harmonies." He watched the senator's mouth tighten in satisfaction, as if Severian had proven the point. And yet Severian continued, "They also say something else, though they do not like to admit it. They say Christianity answers the mood of the century." The tribune finally turned from the window. "The mood," the soldier said, "as if empires have moods." "They do," Severian replied quietly. "So do cities. So do families. So do men who have watched plague, civil war, and betrayal. The philosophers speak of ascent, of turning inward toward the One. The Christians speak of salvation, of a God who enters the world and offers a sure path. Different languages, similar hunger." Osius nodded, slowly, as if Severian had placed a stone exactly where he needed it. The senator leaned forward. "And you?" he demanded. "Do you find this hunger admirable?" Severian met the man's gaze without flinching. "I find it human," he said, "and I find it dangerous." "Dangerous to whom?" the rhetorician asked. "To everyone," Severian said. "Because when fear is answered by certainty, the certainty often demands obedience." A small silence fell, the kind that happens when a truth is admitted but not welcomed. Osius spoke into it, his voice mild. "You think Christianity demands obedience more than the old cults did?" "I think," Severian said, choosing his words, "that the old cults were many. They did not require unity. They required practice, participation, offerings, festivals. They held the empire like a net holds fish, loosely, with many knots. Christianity," he paused, feeling the weight of the room. "Christianity holds itself like a body. It calls itself one. It speaks as if disagreement is not merely difference but sickness." The tribune exhaled. "Rough. That sounds useful," he said. "For an emperor," the senator's eyes gleamed. "Yes, useful. That is exactly it. Constantine has found a tool." Osius did not react as a man insulted. He reacted as a man who had heard this before, and was tired of pretending it was new. "You call it a tool," Osius said. "I call it a truth that has finally found protection." Severian felt the words press against each other. Tool and truth, like two coins rubbed together until one of them wore away. The rhetorician shifted in his chair. "Protection," he said, "changes what it protects. You know this, Bishop. When a faith becomes favored, it learns the vices of power." Osius's gaze did not waver. "And when power meets a faith," he replied, "it learns that it cannot command everything. Not even an emperor can command the soul." Severian watched Julius in the corner, still holding his tablet, his face unreadable. Severian understood then what Julius had meant by Constantine's shadow. The shadow was not simply a policy. It was this new argument, entering rooms like a legal document, reshaping the way men talked about authority. The senator stood, restless. "This is philosophy," he said with contempt. "I deal in administration. Tell me what will happen. Will our temples be safe?" Osius did not answer at once. He looked at Severian instead, as if asking him to witness what the bishop was about to do. "The emperor," Osius said finally, "wants stability. He does not want riots. He does not want cities to break themselves on the question of worship. But he also believes the Christian God has granted him victory. He will honor that." "By favor," Severian said softly, almost to himself. "By appointment. By law that looks like mercy." Julius's stylus paused for a heartbeat, the only sign he had heard. Osius smiled faintly, not at Severian, but at the precision of the phrase. "Yes," the bishop said. "Mercy has its methods." Severian felt the room tighten again. Mercy as method, mercy as administration. That was a new kind of power, softer than persecution, and therefore harder to resist without appearing unreasonable. The tribune stepped forward, voice low. "I have soldiers who worship Mars," he said, "and soldiers who whisper the name of Christ over their bread. If one group thinks the other will soon be punished or rewarded, I will have trouble." Osius nodded. "Then you must give them another reason to obey. Not fear of gods. Fear of discipline." The soldier's mouth twisted. He respected that. Severian felt an elegiac grief rise in him, sudden and unwelcome. He imagined the old gods being reduced to private habits, like old songs sung quietly by old men. He imagined the philosophers trying to preserve their schools by flattering the new religion, rephrasing the one in Christian terms, calling daemons angels, calling assent prayer. Some would do it sincerely, some would do it to survive. Survival, Severian knew, often looked like betrayal from the outside. Osius returned his attention to Severian. "You spoke of philosophical inferiority," the bishop said. "Tell me this. If a teaching consoles the fearful, binds the scattered, and gives men courage to live differently, is it inferior because it is simple?" Severian's throat tightened. He thought of Dodds's world without naming it, a world anxious, haunted by unseen powers, hungry for intermediaries and assurances. He thought of the Christian insistence on one mediator, one path, one story that could be told to slaves and senators alike. "Inferior," Severian said, "is a word philosophers use when they are frightened of losing their role." Osius's eyes softened, just a little. "And inevitable," Severian continued, "is a word men use when they want to excuse themselves from making choices." The room held its breath. Severian looked at Julius, at the tablet, at the quiet machinery of the court taking down every careful sentence. He felt himself standing on a threshold he could not see clearly. Beyond it he sensed counsels, letters, favors, punishments disguised as reforms. Beyond it, he sensed the slow rise of Christian authority, not as a storm, but as a tide. "I will speak to your philosophers," Severian said at last to Osius, "not to convert them, to prepare them. A civilization does not collapse when it is conquered. It collapses when its educated men stop understanding the language of power." Osius inclined his head, accepting. "And I will speak to my bishops," Osius replied, "to remind them that power is a temptation dressed as duty." Julius stepped forward then, the meeting's true end arriving with him. "The emperor's city changes quickly," Julius said. "Choose your words as if they will be repeated by men you have never met." Severian felt that as a warning and a prophecy. When he left the villa, the sun was higher, and the street noises had grown bold. Life went on, as it always did, even when history was quietly rearranging its furniture. Severian walked back toward the heart of Nicomedia, and as he passed a small shop he saw, nailed to the doorframe, a scratched symbol he had learned to recognize, a fish drawn in haste. It was small, almost childish, yet it sat there like a claim. Severian paused, looking at it, and felt the strangest thing. Not anger, not scorn, a kind of weary tenderness, as if he were watching a younger sibling step into adulthood with a confidence that would soon be tested. He touched the wood lightly with 2 fingers, then withdrew his hand, as if the gesture might be misread, and he walked on, carrying with him the knowledge that the debate was no longer in books. It was in doorways. It was in appointments. It was in the way men had begun to speak of mercy as method. That evening Severian returned to the lecture hall, where he usually taught, not because he had a lecture to give, but because he needed to stand inside the old rhythm and see whether it still held. The hall belonged to a patron who loved philosophy the way other men loved racehorses. He loved it for what it said about him. There were benches polished by years of restless bodies, a platform for the speaker, and along the walls, a few statues that had been chosen for their elegance rather than their devotion. Athena with calm eyes, Apollo with a lyre, Hermes poised mid-step, as if about to deliver a message that would never arrive. Severian stood in the doorway and listened to the emptiness. He'd always believed that ideas outlived politics, that empires changed costumes while truth remained. It was a comforting belief, and he had taught it with a seriousness that now felt almost naive. The villa meeting had left him with a new sensation, not panic, but a kind of pressure behind the ribs. He had seen how quickly words could become instruments. Peace, unity, dawn, mercy. Even the word truth, in Osius's mouth, had sounded less like a contemplative vision, and more like a banner that could be carried into law courts. He walked down to the platform and placed his hand on the lectern. The wood was worn smooth where generations of teachers had gripped it. He imagined them, Stoics, Peripatetics, Platonists, men who had watched emperors rise and fall, and still believed the soul could be trained into freedom. Their confidence had been a kind of shelter. Now, for the first time, Severian wondered if the shelter itself was built on something that could rot. Behind him, a voice spoke, low, amused. "You look like a man about to argue with a statue." Severian turned. A familiar figure stepped from the shadows between benches, his cloak thrown back, his hair carefully arranged to look careless. It was Aelian, a fellow Neoplatonist, younger by a decade but already famous for his quick mind and quicker contempt. He had the sharp beauty of a man who believed the world owed him recognition. "Aelian," Severian said, "I didn't know you were in the city." "I am always in the city," Aelian replied. "Cities simply fail to notice until they need something from me." He came closer, his eyes taking in Severian's face with the intimacy of a rival. "You have been seen," Aelian said, "with the Emperor's men." Severian did not deny it. Denial in times like this was a child's game. "I was invited," Severian said. Aelian's smile widened. "And you went," he said. "So the rumors are true. Constantine's court has decided that philosophers are useful again." "Useful," Severian repeated. He felt the word sting, because it was exactly what the senator had said, and he did not like hearing it in Aelian's mouth. Aelian stepped onto the platform beside him, as if claiming equal height. "Tell me," Aelian said softly, "is it true he has become one of them?" Severian heard the disdain in them. The Christians, the ones who met in houses, who buried their dead with stubborn tenderness, who had once been mocked as superstitious, stubborn, socially inconvenient. Now they were becoming socially decisive. Severian looked toward the statues along the wall. "He has preferences," he said. Aelian's laugh was short and bright. "Preferences," he said. "You are careful. Your carefulness has always been your virtue, Severian. It is also your weakness." He leaned in, lowering his voice though the hall was empty. "You know what they say," Aelian continued. "That he saw a sign. That he has made an alliance with the Galilean god. That he will raise bishops as if they were governors." Severian did not answer at once. He found he did not want to argue with Aelian, not because Aelian was right, but because Severian sensed that argument would become performance, and performance would become evidence, and evidence would be used by men like Julius. Instead he said, "What do you think?" Aelian's eyes glinted. "I think it is a mistake," he said. "A crude religion for crude minds. Their god is a tyrant. Their stories are contradiction. Their miracles are cheap. Their morals are fit for slaves." He paused, tasting his own certainty. "And their bishops," he added, "are hungry." Severian felt something tighten in him. He had been told years ago that the first duty of a philosopher was to see clearly even when clarity hurt. Yet clarity here threatened to become something else, a blade rather than a lamp. "You say," Severian replied, "that their morals are fit for slaves, as if slaves do not have souls." Aelian waved that aside. "Souls? Yes, but untrained? Their faith flatters the untrained. It makes ignorance a virtue. Or it makes humility possible," Severian said. Aelian turned, surprised. And for a moment Severian saw the real fear behind the younger man's brilliance. Not fear of persecution. Fear of irrelevance. You sound, Alien said slowly, as if you are considering their argument. Severian felt the interior crisis bloom, quiet and persistent. He had always assumed that his mind would be his refuge. Now his mind was the battlefield. If he defended the old world too fiercely, he would become one of those men who confuse loyalty with blindness. If he surrendered too easily, he would become one of those men who call surrender wisdom after the fact. I am considering, Severian said, the century. Alien scoffed. The century is always sick. That is why philosophy exists. Is it? Severian asked. Or is philosophy sometimes only a way for the healthy to mock the sick? Alien stared at him. The silence between them thickened. You have been speaking with Christians, Alien said. It was not a question. It was an accusation. Severian did not deny it. With one, he said, a bishop. Alien's mouth tightened. And did he speak to you of daemons, of angels, of intermediaries, of the soul's ascent? He spoke to me, Severian said, of peace. Alien laughed again, but this time the sound had no joy. Peace, he said. A fine word to paint on chains. He stepped down from the platform and began to pace among the benches, restless as a caged animal. Severian watched him and remembered Dodds's world again, a world where people felt themselves surrounded by powers they could not name, where the unseen pressed hard against daily life. In such a world, a religion that promised clarity could feel like oxygen. Alien stopped and faced Severian, his voice suddenly earnest. You must not help them, he said. Severian felt the weight of it, not as a command, but as a plea. They will not stop at favors, Alien continued. They will not be satisfied with being allowed. They will want to be right, and when they want to be right, they will need others to be wrong. Severian's mouth went dry. He thought of the word sickness he had used. He thought of Christianity holding itself like a body, and disagreement like disease. He thought of the ease with which an emperor could turn that metaphor into policy. You think, Severian said, they will persecute. Alien's eyes flashed. They have been persecuted. They will call it justice when they return the favor. Severian wanted to dismiss it as bitterness, but he could not. Not after hearing Julius speak of method, after seeing how mercy could be weaponized, how favor could be a slow form of dispossession. And if I do not help, Severian said, what then? They will still rise. They will still learn the language of power. They may do it badly. They may do it cruelly. Alien's face softened with something like despair. Then let them, he said. Let them reveal themselves. Let the emperor discover that he has embraced chaos in the name of unity. Severian looked at the statues again. Athena's face remained calm. Apollo did not flinch. Hermes kept his eternal half-step. The gods of marble did not answer. They never had, not in the way frightened men wanted. He thought of the fish symbol on the shop door, scratched in haste, and how it had felt like a claim, not triumphal, insistent, a small sign that said, we are here, we belong, we will endure. Severian turned back to Alien. There is something, Severian said slowly, that you refuse to see. Alien lifted his chin. Then say it. Severian's voice remained measured, but inside him the words came from a deeper place than argument. You and I, Severian said, have spent our lives learning how to climb away from the world. We call it ascent. We call it purification. We call it the turning of the soul toward the one. He paused, feeling the truth of it like a cold stone. But most people cannot live on that height. They have children. They have debts. They have illnesses. They have dreams that feel like warnings. They fear the dead. They fear the unseen. They fear their own thoughts at night. Alien's expression hardened. And the Christians, Severian went on, do not ask them to climb alone. They gather them. They name their fear. They give it a story and a community. They say, you are not abandoned. They say, your suffering is seen. They say, your soul is not a private project for the educated. It is a thing God has claimed. Alien's eyes narrowed. And you admire this? Severian swallowed. He did not want to be sentimental. Sentimentality was another form of dishonesty. I admire, he said, its power. Alien's voice dropped. Power is exactly the problem. Severian felt the conflict tighten again. He could see both sides. He could see Christianity as spiritually compelling, a medicine for the anxious age, and he could see it as politically dangerous, a unity that might devour difference, and he could see himself, caught between, being asked to lend his words to one side or the other. The door at the back of the hall opened then, and a young man entered, breathless. He wore a simple tunic, no philosopher's cloak, and he looked around with quick, frightened eyes. He saw Severian and hurried forward. "Teacher," he said, voice shaking. "They are asking questions. In the market, men with tablets. They ask who attends your lectures. They ask who speaks against the Christians. They ask who still offers incense." Alien went still. Severian felt Julius's warning echo in him. "Choose your words as if they will be repeated by men you have never met," the young man added, almost in a whisper. "And some say the emperor's favor is going to certain churches. They say the bishop has been invited to judge disputes. They say—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "They say the old days are over." Severian looked at Alien. The younger philosopher's face had changed. The contempt was still there, but now it had been joined by something rawer. Fear, not fear of gods, fear of administration. Severian felt a strange compassion for him, for all of them, for himself, for the empire that had been many things, and was now trying to become one thing without tearing itself apart. He placed a hand on the lectern again, anchoring himself. "Go home," Severian told the young man gently. "Say nothing. Listen more than you speak." The young man nodded and backed away, as if the hall itself had become dangerous. When he was gone, Alien spoke, voice tight. "You see," he said. "The shadow has arrived." Severian did not answer. He watched the empty doorway where the young man had vanished, and he understood that the interior crisis was no longer theoretical. It had entered the daily air. It had taken the shape of questions asked in markets, names written on tablets, favors distributed like quiet verdicts. He turned to Alien. "I will meet with your circle," Severian said. "Tonight, bring the ones who can still think without performing." Alien stared. "To plan resistance, to plan survival," Severian replied. "There is a difference." Alien's mouth twisted, but he nodded once, unwillingly. As Severian left the hall, the city sounded the same as it had yesterday. Carts creaked, merchants argued, children ran. Yet everything felt altered, as if an unseen hand had shifted the weights beneath the surface. The gods still stood in their shrines, the philosophers still talked, the Christians still gathered. But now, Severian thought, the empire was learning a new habit. It was learning to count souls as part of governance, and once a government learns that habit, it rarely forgets. They met that night in a house that had once belonged to a grain merchant. The merchant was dead now, and his sons had divided his property with an efficiency that felt almost impious. The room they used had been stripped of most of its furniture. Only a long table remained, its surface scarred by years of counting and bargaining. The oil lamps were set low, not for drama, but for caution. Alien had gathered 6 men and 1 woman, all of them known in the city's intellectual circles. There was Diotima, whose commentaries on Plato were copied even in Antioch. There was Rufinus, who could recite half of Homer without pause, and believed this counted as proof of civilization. There were 2 younger men, brilliant and nervous, and there was old Maternus, who had served under 3 emperors, and trusted none of them. Severian stood at the head of the table, though he had not meant to. Leadership often arrived by accident. Alien wasted no time. "You have all heard," he said. "The emperor favors the Christians. Their bishops are called into council. Their assemblies are protected. There are whispers of funds redirected. We are here to decide how to respond." "Respond," Rufinus echoed, as if this were an insult at dinner. "It is more than that," Diotima said quietly. "It is an alteration of the air." Severian felt a flicker of gratitude toward her. She had named it well. The air itself had shifted. Conversations were beginning to feel conditional. Words were being weighed for future consequence. Maternus leaned forward, his knotted hands resting on the table. "I have seen this before," he said. "Not with Christians, with generals. When a man rises, those around him adjust their posture. Some bend too quickly. Some remain too stiff. The ones who survive learn to stand without appearing defiant." Alien shot him an irritated look. "We are not discussing posture," he said. "We are discussing truth." "Truth does not keep you employed," Maternus replied. A silence followed that, It was not a proud silence. Severian let the room breathe before he spoke. There are 3 possibilities, he said. First, that this favor is temporary, that Constantine will grow bored of theological disputes and return to the old balance. Second, that Christianity will be allowed but not privileged. Third, he paused, because the third possibility was the one none of them wished to name, that Christianity will become the language of legitimacy. The younger men exchanged glances. One of them, whose name was Calvus, spoke with a tremor he tried to hide. And if it becomes that, Calvus said, what happens to us? Severian did not soften the answer. We become interpreters, he said, or relics. Alien's hand struck the table softly, not in anger, but in frustration. A carpenter's gospel, a God who dies, a book that contradicts itself. Diotima turned to him, her expression cool. You dismiss what you have not studied, she said. I have read some of their writings. They are not all crude. Alien scoffed, but did not answer her. Severian watched them, and felt again the tension between philosophical pride and historical movement. He had always believed that the ascent of the soul was the highest human project. Now he had to admit that most of the empire was not ascending. It was surviving. Consider this, Severian said. Why now? Because Constantine is superstitious, Rufinus said. Because he is clever, Diotima countered. Christians are organized. They meet regularly. They support one another. They span provinces. They write letters. Maternus nodded slowly. They are a network. Severian felt the word settle into the room. Network. The pagan cults were local. They were attached to cities, to families, to trade guilds. Christianity, by contrast, had become something like a body stretched across the empire, its members corresponding, arguing, consoling, correcting. In times of anxiety, Severian said quietly, men look for systems that promise coherence. Our world has not been stable. Plague, civil war, dark woes, rival emperors, fear of unseen forces. He let that last phrase hang, remembering the language of demons and fate that had so permeated educated discourse. Christianity offers a single sovereign power above the flux, and obedience beneath it, Alien added sharply. Yes, Severian agreed, and obedience beneath it. Rufinus shifted in his seat. You speak almost as if you admire it. Severian did not flinch. I admire its answer to the age, he said, not necessarily its conclusions. Calvus swallowed. What does that mean? It means, Severian replied, that if we continue to speak as if philosophy alone can steady the common man, we will be speaking to empty rooms. Alien's face tightened. You would have us convert, he said. No, Severian answered at once. I would have us understand. He moved slowly around the table, his hand trailing over the scarred wood. If Christianity becomes the emperor's favored discourse, it will not do so only by force. It will do so because it answers a need. That is its strength. If we wish to preserve what is true in our tradition, we must decide whether we can translate it. Translate the one into their god, Diotima said thoughtfully, or discover, Severian replied, that they are attempting the same ascent by another path. Alien stood abruptly. This is capitulation dressed as wisdom, he said. You think, because you have dined with the bishop, you have glimpsed the future. But power corrupts. When their bishops taste authority, they will not remain humble. They will legislate their piety. Maternus gave a dry chuckle. All authority legislates, he said. Severian felt the room slipping toward anger. He raised a hand. There is another danger, he said. They turned to him. If Christianity becomes the language of legitimacy, Severian continued, it may also fracture. It calls itself one body. But bodies can fight within themselves. If bishops disagree, if doctrines clash, if rival interpretations claim imperial backing, we may see not unity, but sharper division. Diotima's eyes lit faintly. You think their unity is fragile. I think any unity that seeks universality invites dispute, Severian said. The more belief claims to encompass all truth, the more fiercely it must define error. Alien stopped pacing. And you would insert yourself into this, he said slowly. To mediate, to prevent unnecessary cruelty, Severian replied. If philosophers withdraw entirely, we leave the field to zealots and administrate. The word zealots lingered, unpleasant. Calvus spoke again, quieter now. What if it is inevitable? The room stilled. Severian felt the weight of that word press against his chest. I do not believe in inevitability, he said carefully. I believe in tendencies. And this tendency, Diotima asked, points where? Severian thought of Julius, of Ossius, of Constantine's invisible presence shaping conversations. He thought of the fish symbol, of names being written down in markets, of favor distributed like silent currency. It points, he said, toward a civilization that names its spiritual allegiance publicly, toward a state that claims to protect truth, toward a narrowing of ambiguity. Alien's voice was softer now. And you think ambiguity is necessary? I think, Severian said. That mystery is healthier when it is not policed. Silence again. Outside, a cart rolled past, its wheels grinding against stone. The sound was ordinary, grounding. Life continued. Maternus leaned back, exhaling slowly. So, he said, what do we do tomorrow? It was the simplest and hardest question. Severian answered without ornament. Tomorrow, he said, we teach as we always have. But we listen more closely. We choose our metaphors carefully. We avoid mockery. We study their writings. We speak to bishops without flattery. We prepare for councils. Councils, Alien repeated. Yes, Severian said. If this faith grows within imperial favor, disputes will not remain private. They will require arbitration, and emperors dislike theological chaos. Diotima nodded slowly. You believe there will be a gathering? Yes, Severian said, a large one. He did not yet know its name. He did not yet know it would be called Nicaea. But he felt its approach the way one feels thunder before rain. Alien watched him with a complicated expression. You are changing, Alien said. Severian met his gaze. No, he said quietly. The world is. The lamps flickered as a draft moved through the room. For a moment the shadows on the walls seemed to shift into strange shapes, elongated and unstable. Civilizations did not fall like statues pushed from pedestals. They bent. They rephrased themselves. They adopted new grammars. As they left the merchant's house one by one, Severian lingered in the doorway. The night was cooler now. Somewhere in the distance, a hymn rose faintly, unfamiliar in melody, but steady in conviction. He did not know whether he was witnessing philosophical decline or spiritual reorientation. He only knew that he was standing at the hinge of something vast. And hinges, he thought, are small pieces of metal that bear enormous weight. The summons came not as a proclamation, but as a letter sealed with careful wax. Severian was at his desk when it arrived, reviewing a passage of Plotinus he had known for years, yet suddenly found insufficient. The letter bore the insignia of the imperial household, not grand but unmistakable. It did not request his presence. It informed him of it, a gathering at Nicaea, a council, not a philosophical symposium, not a private consultation, a council called by the emperor himself. He held the letter in his hands for a long time before breaking the seal, as if the wax itself might offer resistance. When he read the contents, his breath slowed, not in relief, but in recognition. The disputes among the Christians, it said, had grown disruptive. There were divisions concerning the nature of their Christ. Was he equal to the Father? Was he subordinate? Was he created? Was he eternal? The quarrel had begun in Alexandria, but it had spread, as such quarrels do, through letters and loyalties. Bishops had begun to write against bishops. Congregations were whispering. Some cities had already tasted unrest. Constantine, the letter explained, desired unity. Severian let the word settle again in his mind. Unity. It had been spoken in villas and lecture halls. Now it was written in imperial ink. He set the letter down and closed his eye. He had predicted this. A faith that claimed universality would inevitably dispute its boundary. The more absolute the truth, the more dangerous disagreement became. And now the emperor would arbitrate theology. This, Severian understood, was the real shift. Not the tolerance of Christians, not even the favor shown to bishops, but the moment when imperial authority entered doctrinal dispute. He rose and walked to the window. The city below moved with its usual indifference. Bakers shouted. Children chased one another between carts. A man argued with a mule. Yet somewhere beyond these ordinary sounds, history was tightening its rope. A knock came at the door. Alien entered without waiting for permission. His face was pale, but not from illness. You have received it, Alien said. Yes, so it is true. Yes. Alien stepped further into the room, his movements restless. They quarrel about their Christ, he said, about whether he is like their God or identical to him. as if metaphysics were a matter for bakers. Severian did not smile. Metaphysics has always been a matter for bakers, he said quietly. It only took philosophers to pretend otherwise. Alien stared at him. You defend them again. I observe them, Severian replied. He handed the letter to Alien, who read it quickly, his lips tightening. You will preside, Alien said. An emperor presiding over theology. Yes, this is madness. It is governance, Severian corrected. Alien flung the letter back onto the desk. They will fight, he said. And he will choose a side. Yes, Severian said. And that side will become law. Yes, the word law lingered between them like smoke. Severian felt the gravity of it in his bones. If Constantine endorsed a formulation of belief, that belief would not remain merely devotional. It would acquire the force of imperial preference. It would define orthodoxy, not only spiritually, but politically. He remembered Ossius's face, calm, measured. He remembered Julius's tablet. He remembered the young man in the market, breathless. This was the hinge. Why you? Alien asked suddenly. Severian blinked. Why are you summoned? You are not a Christian. No. You are not a bishop. No. Then why? Severian considered. Because, he said slowly, they fear philosophy. Alien's eyes narrowed. They fear that their disputes will be mocked. Yes. And perhaps that their language will fracture further under analysis. Alien gave a humorless laugh. And you are to serve as what? A translator? A witness? A stabilizer? Severian said. The word felt heavy in his mouth. Alien moved closer, lowering his voice. You realize what this means, he said. If you attend, you lend legitimacy. You stand in that hall as a sign that educated men do not oppose this merging of throne and altar. Severian felt the accusation, but he did not recoil. And if I refuse, he asked, what then? The council proceeds without any voice that understands our tradition. Alien's jaw tightened. You believe you can influence it? No, Severian said honestly. I believe I can understand it, and perhaps prevent a worse outcome. Alien turned away, pacing. You are too calm, he said. Do you not see? If the emperor enforces a doctrine, dissent will become disobedience. Yes, Severian said. And you are not afraid. Severian considered that. I am afraid, he said. But not of the same thing you are. Alien stopped and faced him. What are you afraid of? Severian spoke slowly, because the words felt newly formed. I am afraid that if we dismiss Christianity as philosophically inferior, we will fail to see why it endures. And if we fail to see why it endures, we will respond either with ridicule or with panic. Both will make us small. Alien's expression flickered, anger mixed with something like admiration. And what if it is spiritually inevitable? Alien pressed. Severian's gaze drifted to the desk, to the letter. In the sense that it answers the century's hunger, he said, perhaps, but inevitability is not destiny. It still requires men to act. Constantine is acting. And you, Alien said. I am choosing to watch closely. Alien exhaled sharply. You are choosing to step into the machinery. Yes. Silence fell. After a moment, Alien's voice softened. If they condemn dissent, he said, what then? Severian did not answer immediately. He thought of philosophers branded as stubborn relics. He thought of Christians who might soon be labeled heretics by their own brethren. He thought of the empire learning to distinguish correct belief from incorrect belief as a matter of order. Then, Severian said quietly, we will discover how much mercy their God truly commands. Alien gave him a long look. You sound, he said, as if you hope they will fail their own ideal. Severian shook his head. I hope, he said, that power will not erase their humility. Outside, the light shifted. Afternoon was deepening toward evening. Alien moved toward the door. If you attend, he said, write to me. I will. And if it turns ugly? Severian met his gaze. It will, he said. Alien nodded once, sharply, and left. Severian returned to the desk, and lifted the letter again. He traced the imperial seal with his thumb. In another age, councils had been gatherings of bishops debating theology in relative obscurity. Now this council would gather under imperial gaze. It would be guarded by soldiers. Its conclusions would travel along official roads. He imagined the hall at Nicaea filled with men in plain robes, arguing about words that seemed too small to bear such consequence. Homoousios, of the same substance, a single term that could divide cities. He felt a strange, almost tender sorrow for them. They believed they were defending truth. They were also constructing civilization. He sat down and began to write. Not to Constantine, not to Osius, but to himself. If Christianity proves philosophically inconsistent yet politically unifying, what is its true nature? If it proves spiritually compelling yet administratively harsh, where does responsibility lie? With the faith, or with the emperor who protects it? The questions flowed faster than answers. When at last he set the stylus down, the sky outside had darkened. The first stars were visible, faint against the fading blue. He stepped out onto the street and looked upward. The same sky Constantine had looked at. The same sky in which men claimed to see signs. Severian saw no sign. Only stars, indifferent and steady. Yet he could not shake the sense that beneath those stars, something irreversible had begun. Not a collapse, a reorientation. Civilizations, he thought, do not end with fire. They end when their ultimate loyalties shift. And in that shift, philosophers must decide whether to resist the tide or learn its direction. He turned back inside. Nicaea awaited. The road to Nicaea was lined with spring. Olive groves shimmered in pale light. The air held the scent of damp earth and distant water. Travelers moved in loose clusters along the imperial road. Some in plain robes, some in heavier cloaks, some escorted by attendants who carried scroll cases and small chests. Soldiers were present too, but discreetly, stationed at intervals like punctuation. Severian traveled with a small delegation from Nicomedia, including 2 Christian presbyters and a scribe who had the anxious habit of whispering prayers under his breath whenever the road narrowed. He listened more than he spoke. The presbyters debated quietly behind him. They spoke of Arius of Alexandria, of his insistence that the sun had been created, that there was a time when he was not. They spoke of Alexander, who opposed him fiercely, who insisted on the eternal equality of father and son. Words rose and fell in low argument. Generated, begotten, substance. Severian heard the familiar structure beneath the unfamiliar vocabulary. These were metaphysical distinctions. These were questions philosophers had wrestled with under different names. How does the one relate to the many? How does the perfect generate without diminishing itself? How can unity produce multiplicity without fracture? He almost smiled. Christianity, for all its suspicion of philosophy, had stumbled directly into it. They reached Nicaea near midday. The city had dressed itself for importance. Banners hung from gates. Officials moved briskly through the streets. Inns were crowded with clergy from provinces Severian had only read about. Latin mingled with Greek. There were dark-skinned bishops from the south, pale-faced priests from the north, men with accents thick as wool, and others whose speech cut clean as glass. The gathering was not merely theological. It was imperial. They were ushered into a large hall, prepared for the council. It was not ornate. The decoration was minimal, the space cleared for purpose. At the far end stood a raised seat for the emperor, not a throne in the pagan sense, not draped in gold and incense, but unmistakably elevated. Severian paused just inside the entrance. He had attended philosophical assemblies before. He had seen heated debates about the nature of the good, about fate and free will, but this was different. The stakes here were not only intellectual, they were civic. He saw Osius near the front, speaking with a cluster of bishops. Osius caught his eye and inclined his head in greeting. A murmur rippled through the hall. Constantine had entered. He did not wear a crown. He wore imperial purple, yes, but without ostentation. His posture was controlled, his expression measured. He walked slowly to the raised seat, acknowledging the bishops with restrained courtesy. Severian watched him carefully. This was the man who had seen a sign in the sky, or claimed to. This was the man who had decided that unity required doctrine. He did not look possessed or ecstatic. He looked practical. When he spoke, his voice carried without strain. He spoke of division, of shame that Christians should quarrel publicly, of the empire's need for concord. He framed his concern in moral terms, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Disunity was disorder. Disorder was weakness. Severian felt a small ache in his chest. Here it was, the merging of spiritual language with administrative anxiety. Constantine finished by urging the bishops to resolve their differences quickly. He expressed hope that the council would restore harmony. Then he sat. The debates began almost at once. Arius himself stood at one point, thin and intense. He argued with sharp clarity that the Son could not be co-eternal with the Father without compromising the uniqueness of God. There must have been a time when the Son was not. To say otherwise was to blur distinction. Severian felt the logic. It was clean, almost philosophical. Then Alexander responded, his voice steady but charged. If the Son were not fully divine, he argued, salvation would be incomplete. Only God could save. Only what was fully divine could reconcile humanity. To reduce the Son was to reduce hope. The hall stirred. Bishops muttered. Some nodded. Others frowned deeply. Severian sat near the back, listening, absorbing. This was no crude religion of fishermen. This was metaphysics sharpened by devotion. Yet beneath the argument, he sensed something else. Fear. If Arius were correct, the unity of God remained intact. But Christ became subordinate, perhaps less certain as mediator. If Alexander were correct, God's unity became more mysterious, perhaps more paradoxical. Each position preserved something and threatened something else. The bishops did not argue like philosophers detached from consequence. They argued like men defending the stability of their congregations. Osius rose at one point, attempting to calm the exchange. He spoke of language, of the need for precision without excess. He introduced a term that had begun to circulate, homoousios, of the same substance. The word fell into the hall like a stone into water. Severian felt the ripple instantly. Philosophically, it was bold. It asserted identity of essence between Father and Son. It risked collapsing distinction for the sake of unity. Yet, it also answered the emotional need for certainty. The debates intensified. Some objected that the term was not found in Scripture. Others insisted that Scripture required interpretation. Voices rose. A few bishops shouted. One elderly man wept openly. Constantine watched. He did not intervene in the arguments, but his presence shaped them. Every bishop knew that the emperor desired resolution. Every bishop knew that imperial favor would follow clarity. Severian felt the interior tension sharpen again. Was this philosophical inferiority, or was it something else? Christians were wrestling with questions that had occupied pagan thinkers for centuries. Yet they did so with a different urgency. For them, doctrine was not a matter of intellectual elegance. It was a matter of salvation. Severian remembered Aelian's warning. When they want to be right, they will need others to be wrong. As the hours passed, drafts of creeds were proposed. Lines were altered. Phrases inserted and removed. The word homoousios remained. At last, a formulation began to settle. The Son, begotten not made, of the same substance with the Father. Severian felt a strange mixture of admiration and apprehension. Admiration, because the language was precise, daring, conceptually rigorous. Apprehension, because once endorsed by the emperor, it would not be merely theology. It would be standard. He looked at Constantine again. The emperor's face was composed, but attentive. When the majority of bishops signaled assent, Constantine nodded once. It was not dramatic. It was almost gentle. Yet in that nod, Severian felt the axis shift. A doctrine had become imperial policy. A minority resisted. A few refused to sign. Their refusal was noted. Their names recorded. Severian's stomach tightened. Unity had been achieved, at a cost. As the hall slowly emptied, voices low and exhausted, Severian remained seated. He felt no triumph, no despair, only clarity. Christianity was not philosophically inferior. It was philosophically ambitious. But ambition under imperial protection carried consequences. He rose at last and stepped into the courtyard. The sky above Nicaea was wide and blue. Birds crossed it without regard for creeds. Severian breathed deeply. Civilization had not ended today. It had defined itself. And definitions, he knew, are both foundations and fences. The signatures dried slowly. Wax cooled. Ink darkened. Names hardened into record. Severian watched as one reluctant bishop pressed his seal with visible hesitation, as if by delaying he might alter the tide. Another refused entirely. His refusal was not loud. It was steady. He stood apart, eyes fixed not on Constantine but on the text itself, as though the words were the only authority he recognized. The imperial secretaries noted the dissenters carefully. No thunder followed. No immediate punishment. Constantine rose once more and spoke of harmony restored, of discord resolved. His tone was congratulatory, almost paternal. He praised the bishops for their unity, as though unity had been waiting patiently all along. Severian felt the paradox settle. Unity achieved through imperial expectation. He stepped outside again as the council adjourned for the day. The courtyard buzzed with low conversation. Some bishops embraced, others argued in hushed tones. A few withdrew entirely, retreating to shaded corners like men who had swallowed something indigestible. Osius approached him. "You have been quiet," the bishop said. "I am observing," Severian replied. Osius nodded. "And what do you observe?" Severian did not answer immediately. He studied Osius's face, searching for signs of triumph or anxiety. He found neither in excess, only calculation softened by conviction. "I observe," Severian said slowly, "that theology has become public architecture." Osius's brow lifted slightly. "Explain." "You have constructed a definition," Severian continued. "It is elegant, it is bold, but now it must bear weight. Disputes will not vanish. They will become dissent, and dissent, under imperial protection of orthodoxy, becomes dangerous." Osius did not deny it. "You fear persecution," he said. "I fear," Severian replied, "that truth enforced by power forgets its origin." Osius considered that. "And yet," the bishop said, "without power, truth is mocked." Severian smiled faintly. "Perhaps," he said, "truth must sometimes endure mockery to remain itself." Osius's gaze drifted toward the hall. "You are not wrong," he said quietly, "but you underestimate the damage division causes. Congregations have split. Priests have defied their bishops. The emperor does not care for metaphysical nuance. He cares for stability." "Stability," Severian repeated. "Yes, and if stability requires exile," Severian asked, "will you accept it?" Osius did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was low. "I accept what preserves the body." The phrase echoed in Severian's mind. Preserves the body. Christianity had long called itself a body, its members interdependent. Now the metaphor had acquired legal muscle. Severian turned to watch the dissenting bishop depart under quiet escort. No chains, no spectacle, simply a journey elsewhere. Exile could be clean. It could also be final. "You think this is the beginning," Osius said. "I think," Severian replied, "this is the moment the empire learns how to define heresy." Osius did not flinch. "Perhaps," he said, "it is the moment heresy learns it cannot hide behind ambiguity." Severian felt again the interior fracture. He could see the necessity from Osius's perspective. A religion fractured at its core might dissolve into competing sects, each claiming truth, each destabilizing cities. The emperor's involvement promised coherence. Yet coherence purchased by force reshaped fate. As evening settled, Constantine held a small reception. Not lavish, but symbolic. Bishops were welcomed as honored guests. They stood where senators once dominated. Conversations flowed under imperial light. Severian moved carefully among them. He overheard a Western bishop marvel at the emperor's humility. He heard an Eastern cleric worry quietly about how Arius's supporters would respond. He saw a young deacon gazing at Constantine as though at a saint. The shift was visible. Christian leaders now inhabited imperial space. A tribune approached Severian unexpectedly. "You are the philosopher," the soldier said. "So I am told," Severian replied. The tribune glanced around, lowering his voice. "Do they know what they have done?" he asked. Severian considered the question. "They believe they have defended truth," he said. The tribune nodded. "And the emperor," the soldier continued, "he believes he has defended order?" "Yes." The tribune's jaw tightened. "I have men who favored Arius," he said. "Quiet men, loyal. What do I tell them?" Severian felt the weight of governance pressing down from another angle. "You tell them," he said carefully, "that the empire remains theirs. That disagreement is not rebellion, but you also tell them to guard their tongues." The tribune gave a short nod. "So we begin?" "Yes," Severian said. The soldier departed. Severian stood alone for a moment, beneath the fading light. He remembered Alien's voice in the lecture hall. "When they want to be right, they will need others to be wrong." Now wrongness had been formalized. He walked to the edge of the courtyard and looked beyond the walls toward the lake that shimmered faintly in the dusk. Was Christianity spiritually inevitable? In one sense, yes. It had grown precisely because it offered certainty in an age of uncertainty. It had created a network of belonging in a fractured world. It had spoken of salvation not as philosophical ascent, but as divine descent, a God entering history rather than demanding escape from it. That descent had proved compelling, yet now it rose. From house churches to imperial halls, from persecuted minority to protected orthodoxy. The question was no longer whether Christianity would survive. It was whether it would remain itself. Severian felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Osseous again. "You are troubled," the bishop said. "I am reflective," Severian replied. Osseous smiled faintly. "Reflection can become paralysis, and action," Severian said, "can become regret." They stood in silence. At length Osseous spoke. "You wonder if we have betrayed humility?" Severian met his gaze. "Yes." Osseous exhaled slowly. "We have risked it," he admitted. The honesty surprised Severian. "But," Osseous continued, "humility does not require weakness. If we believe Christ is truly divine, then clarity is not arrogance, it is fidelity." Severian considered that. "And if clarity wounds," he asked, "then we pray the wound heals cleanly." The answer was neither triumphant nor dismissive. Severian felt a small reluctant respect. Christianity was not philosophically naive. It was willing to define itself. Whether that definition would harden into cruelty remained to be seen. As darkness settled fully, torches were lit along the courtyard walls. Shadows stretched long and uncertain. Severian watched the bishops depart in clusters. A civilization had pivoted quietly today, not through battle, through definition. He sensed that the aftershocks would not be immediate. They would ripple outward through provinces, through sermons, through laws drafted with careful phrasing. He also sensed something else. The philosophers would not vanish. They would adapt. Some would reinterpret the creed in Platonic terms. Some would resist openly. Some would convert sincerely. Civilization shift did not mean annihilation. It meant reconfiguration. Severian turned back toward his lodging. The night air was cool. He felt older than he had that morning. Nicaea had not resolved the tension within him. It had clarified it. Christianity was neither inferior nor inevitable in isolation. It was powerful. And power, he knew, always asked to be justified. When Severian returned to Nicomedia, the city did not look different. That unsettled him more than spectacle would have. The temple still stood. Smoke still rose from certain altars at dawn. The statue of Zeus in the civic square still received garlands from habit and inheritance. Yet beneath these continuities, language had shifted. And language, Severian knew, is where civilizations are reassembled. Within days of his return, copies of the creed from Nicaea began to circulate. Not in full imperial flourish at first, but through episcopal letters, through formal readings in churches, through recitations that felt almost liturgical in their insistence. Begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father. The phrases began to echo in markets and courtyards. Some repeated them with pride, others with confusion, a few with quiet resistance. Severian attended one such reading in a modest church near the harbor. He stood at the back, unnoticed. The congregation was mixed. Artisans, widows, children, 2 soldiers, a merchant he recognized from the grain quarter. The bishop read slowly, deliberately. When he reached the word homoousios, he paused, as if measuring the congregation's breath. The word hung in the air, unfamiliar yet heavy. Afterward, questions arose. "What does it mean?" a woman asked. "It means," the bishop replied, "that the Son shares the very being of the Father, that there is no lesser divinity in Christ." The answer was careful, simplified, yet firm. Severian watched the faces around him. Some nodded in relief, others furrowed their brows, but no one laughed. No one dismissed it as abstraction. This, Severian realized, was what Alien had failed to grasp. For the congregation, the doctrine was not metaphysical decoration. It was assurance. If Christ were fully divine, then the bridge between human suffering and divine power was unbroken. He left the church and walked toward the agora. There, under open sky, a small group of Arius's supporters had gathered. They were not rioting, they were arguing. Their leader, a presbyter with sharp features, spoke passionately about preserving God's transcendence, about refusing to compromise divine unity. The crowd listened. A magistrate observed from a distance. Severian felt the tension hum, not yet violence, but the awareness that certain words now carried risk. That afternoon he was summoned again, not to a villa, but to the residence of a provincial governor. The governor was a practical man, neither devout nor hostile. "I have received instructions," he said, gesturing toward a scroll. "Clergy who refuse the creed are to be removed from office." Persistent agitators are to be relocated. Relocated, Severian repeated. Yes. Exile. Severian translated softly. The governor did not contradict him. I do not enjoy this, the governor said. But discord spreads quickly. If Alexandria fractures, so does Antioch. If Antioch fractures, so does this city. Severian felt again the echo of Constantine's anxiety. Stability. Do you believe the doctrine? Severian asked. The governor shrugged. I believe in quiet streets, he said. There it was. The creed as instrument of order. Severian left the residence with a heaviness he had not felt at Nicaea itself. In the council hall, debate had been intense but elevated. Here, consequences descended into daily administration. He sought out Alien that evening. The younger philosopher greeted him with restrained fury. It begins, Alien said. Yes, Severian replied. They are removing priests, silencing dissent, yes, and you still call this necessary? Severian did not answer immediately. He walked to the window of Alien's study, looking out over rooftops bathed in the amber of late light. I call it predictable, he said. Alien paced. You told us they would define heresy, he said. You did not say how swiftly. Did you expect delay? Severian asked quietly. Alien stopped. No. They stood in silence. At last Alien spoke, more subdued. You were right about one thing, he admitted. They are not intellectually crude. Their arguments at Nicaea were sharp. Severian inclined his head. But sharpness does not excuse severity, Alien added. No, Severian agreed. He turned to face him. Tell me honestly, Severian said. If philosophers held imperial favor, would we be gentler? Alien's mouth opened to respond, then closed. We value ambiguity, Alien said finally. Yes, Severian replied, because ambiguity preserves our authority. It requires interpretation. Alien's eyes flashed. You accuse us of self-interest. I accuse us of humanity. The word settled between them. Severian felt the interior crisis sharpen further. Christianity was no longer merely a spiritual phenomenon. It had entered the bloodstream of governance. Its rise was not only devotional, but structural. Yet he could not dismiss its appeal. In the streets, Christian charity had become more visible. Alms were distributed with greater confidence. Orphans were gathered under church protection. Widows spoke of belonging with new assurance. The body metaphor was not empty. It generated tangible care, but the same structure that nurtured could exclude. He thought of Dodds's description of an age anxious and hungry for mediation between visible and invisible realms. Christianity had offered a singular mediator. Now it enforced a singular interpretation of that mediator. Civilization is shifting, Severian said quietly. Alien looked at him. Toward what? Toward confession, Severian replied. Toward declared allegiance. Toward a narrowing of spiritual plurality. And we, Alien asked, we must decide whether to adapt, resist, or withdraw. Alien laughed softly. You speak like a strategist. I speak like a survivor. The room dimmed as evening deepened. Alien sank into a chair. You know what I fear most, he said. What? That in 2 generations, children will grow up unable to imagine a world without a single God, unable to imagine festivals without doctrine, unable to imagine philosophy without permission. Severian felt a quiet ache. Yes, he said, that may come, and you do not mourn. I do, Severian replied. But I also see something else. What? I see an empire that has long been spiritually fragmented. Cult upon cult, right upon right. Christianity, for all its severity, gathers. Alien looked at him with weary frustration. You admire its coherence. I recognize its power. Outside, a church bell rang. Still a rare sound in Nicomedia, but no longer unfamiliar. Severian closed his eyes briefly. The bell did not silence the temples, but it claimed time. Time itself was being reoriented. He opened his eyes and looked at Alien. We are not watching the death of philosophy, he said. We are watching its relocation. Alien frowned. Into what? Into theology. The word felt strange, yet accurate. Philosophical questions would not vanish. They would be absorbed, reframed, baptized. Alien shook his head slowly. Then the old gods are truly finished. Severian hesitated. No, he said at last, they are becoming memory. And memory, he knew, can endure quietly, even when it no longer governs. As he left Alien's house that night, The city felt neither triumphant nor shattered. It felt transitional, the kind of feeling that only later generations will name as epochal. Severian walked beneath the starlit sky, aware that he was living inside a hinge. Civilization was not collapsing. It was confessing. And confession, once public, reshapes everything. The first exile left quietly. Arius himself did not depart from Nicomedia, but one of his sympathizers did, a presbyter named Eusebius, who had refused to sign the creed and refused to retract his position. There was no public spectacle, no chains, no shouting. A decree was read in measured tones, and he was instructed to remove himself from the city. Severian watched from a distance as Eusebius gathered a few belongings and stepped into a cart. A small group accompanied him partway down the road. They did not sing. They did not protest. They walked in silence, as if uncertain which emotion was permitted. The machinery was working. Mercy as method. Exile instead of execution. Yet Severian felt no comfort in the moderation. He understood something new now. Power does not require brutality to reshape the world. It requires continuity. The churches in Nicomedia began to read the Nicene Creed regularly. It became a marker of belonging. Those who hesitated were noted. Those who protested were counseled. Those who persisted were transferred. Language was tightening. Meanwhile, in pagan circles, the tone shifted as well. Mockery diminished. Caution grew. Aelian convened fewer open discussions. Lectures on the ascent of the soul were now framed as explorations of universal truth, rather than implicit critiques of Christian doctrine. Diotima, with characteristic intelligence, began to write a commentary comparing Platonic participation with the Christian notion of incarnation, not as surrender, but as translation. Severian saw in her work something inevitable and yet creative. If Christianity was rising, philosophy would not simply die. It would rearticulate itself inside the new grammar. One afternoon, he was summoned unexpectedly to the governor's residence again. This time the mood was strained. There had been disturbances, the governor said without greeting. In the market, Severian guessed. Yes, Arians and Nicenas arguing loudly. A pagan merchant accused the Christians of dividing the city. A Christian deacon accused the merchant of blasphemy. And a crowd formed. Severian felt the tremor in that simple phrase. And what happened? The crowd dispersed when soldiers arrived. Good, Severian said quietly. The governor looked at him sharply. Do not mistake me, the official replied. This is not resolve. The creed did not erase conviction. No, Severian said. It clarified allegiance. The governor leaned forward. I require your counsel. Severian blinked. My counsel. You move between circles, the governor said. Philosophers respect you. Bishops tolerate you. Speak plainly. Will this escalate? Severian considered. Yes, he said. The governor did not seem surprised. How far? That depends, Severian replied, on whether the emperor insists on uniformity beyond what the population can absorb. The governor exhaled. Uniformity is efficient. It is also brittle, Severian said. Silence. The governor's fingers tapped lightly on the table. The emperor believes unity strengthens the empire, he said. He is not wrong, Severian replied. And you? I believe, Severian said slowly, that unity enforced too quickly fractures what it seeks to bind. The governor leaned back. You sound almost Christian, he said. Severian allowed himself a faint smile. I sound observant. When he left the residence, he did not return home immediately. Instead, he walked toward the old temple district. The columns stood tall, their marble weathered but dignified. Offerings still lay at the feet of statues. Incense curled upward in thin, patient streams. A priest adjusted a wreath with quiet devotion. Severian felt an unexpected surge of tenderness. These rites had once bound the empire loosely, like a tapestry of varied threads. No single pattern dominated. Cities had their patron gods. Families had household shrines. Diversity had been ordinary. Now a different pattern was emerging, tighter, more coherent, more demanding. He entered the temple and stood before the statue of Apollo. Are you finished? He murmured under his breath. The marble face did not answer. Yet Severian sensed that the old gods were not vanishing in fire. They were fading into habit, into nostalgia, into art. A group of young men entered the temple, laughing softly. They bowed quickly, almost mechanically, and left again, The gesture felt more cultural than devotional. Severian stepped back outside. On the far side of the square, a small Christian gathering distributed bread to the poor. A widow embraced a deacon. A child clutched a loaf with fierce gratitude. The contrast was not lost on him. The temple preserved tradition. The church created community. Civilization was tilting toward community. He walked slowly toward the harbor, the smell of salt and tar thick in the air. Alien found him there. "You look like a man attending a funeral," Alien said. "Whose?" Severian asked. "Ours." Severian did not respond immediately. "Perhaps," he said at last, "we are attending a birth." Alien frowned. "Do not romanticize it." "I am not," Severian replied. "Birth is violent." They stood side by side, watching ships rock gently against their moorings. "Do you still believe," Alien asked quietly, "that Christianity is not philosophically inferior?" Severian considered the question carefully. "No," he said, "it is not inferior. It is different. It privileges history over abstraction, incarnation over ascent, certainty over speculation. And you prefer?" "I prefer clarity without coercion," Severian replied. Alien's mouth twitched. "Then you prefer something that rarely exists." "Yes." The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of a hymn from a nearby house. Alien listened, irritation flickering across his face. "They sing as if they have already won," he said. "They sing," Severian replied, "because they believe they are seen." Silence again. After a time, Alien spoke softly. "If this continues, temples will empty." "Yes, and bishops will judge disputes." "Yes, and philosophy will kneel." Severian shook his head. "No, philosophy will change." Alien looked at him sharply. "Into what?" "Into theology," Severian said again. "Into mysticism. Into commentary on scripture. Into arguments about substance and essence, framed in Christian terms." Alien's expression shifted slowly from anger to something more complex. "You believe the old wisdom will survive inside the new." "I believe," Severian said, "that truth migrates." They watched the water for a long time. Finally, Alien spoke once more. "And what of you?" Severian felt the question land deep. He looked out across the harbor, where ships departed toward provinces already feeling the ripple of Nicaea. "I will remain," he said. Between what? Between admiration and caution. Between understanding and resistance." Alien exhaled softly. "That is a narrow place." "Yes," Severian said, "but civilization now moves through narrow places." The sun dipped low, staining the water with amber light. In that fading glow, Severian understood something with sudden clarity. The shift was not simply from pagan to Christian. It was from plurality to definition, from ambiguity to confession, and confession, once tied to power, redraws the map of belonging. He turned from the harbor. The hinge was still turning. Summer thickened over Nicomedia. Heat settled into the stone and lingered long after sunset. Markets grew irritable. Arguments flared more quickly. The smell of sweat, grain, incense and harbor, salt mingled in a heavy, almost oppressive air. Severian noticed that tempers rose more easily when doctrine was discussed. He had begun to receive invitations from unexpected quarters. A Christian deacon asked him to speak privately about the language of substance. A magistrate requested his opinion on how to address mixed marriages, in which one spouse refused the creed. A pagan patron wondered aloud whether he should fund repairs to a temple roof, or redirect his wealth toward public baths to avoid appearing oppositional. The questions were no longer theoretical. Civilization was recalculating its investments. One evening, Severian accepted an invitation to dine at the house of a wealthy Christian merchant named Leontius. The house was modest compared to senatorial villas, yet it carried a new confidence. The walls bore no statues, but there were shelves filled with codices, scripture, letters of bishops, treatises defending the Nicene formulation. Leontius greeted him warmly. "You honor us," the merchant said. Severian inclined his head. "I observe," he replied. Leontius laughed softly. "You philosophers always observe." They reclined at table. The conversation was measured at first. Trade routes, recent shipments, minor news from Nicaea. But eventually, Leontius leaned closer. "You were there," he said. "Yes." "Was it as decisive as we hear?" Severian chose his words carefully. "It was decisive," he said. Whether it remains so depends on what follows. Leontius nodded. There is relief among us, he admitted. For years we feared division would weaken the church from within. And now we fear resentment. Severian studied him. You are honest. Leontius gave a thin smile. I am practical. He gestured toward the codices. Our faith survived persecution, he said. It must now survive favor. The phrase struck Severian sharply. Survive favor. He thought of Dodds's description of the religious anxiety of late antiquity, of the search for protection against unseen powers. Christianity had thrived under pressure, its community strengthened by marginalization. Now, shielded by imperial preference, it risked something subtler. What do you fear most? Severian asked. That we become what we once condemned, Leontius replied without hesitation. Arrogant, coercive, blind to our own ambition. Severian felt a strange warmth toward the man. Power reveals, he said quietly. Yes, Leontius agreed, and distorts. They ate in thoughtful silence for a moment. Do you believe, Leontius asked carefully, that our doctrine is philosophically sound? Severian did not evade. It is rigorous, he said. It grapples with unity and distinction in ways that echo older debates. It is not crude. Leontius seemed relieved. But, Severian continued, rigor does not guarantee humility. Leontius nodded. We are learning, he said. Too quickly, perhaps. Later that night, as Severian walked home, he passed a group of young Christian men arguing heatedly with an elderly pagan priest. Mute. Their voices were sharp, almost triumphant. You are outdated, one of them said. The priest's shoulders sagged, but he did not retaliate. Severian stepped between them. That is enough, he said quietly. The young men recognized him and fell silent. Outdated, Severian repeated. Is that how you describe what fed your fathers? They looked ashamed, but only slightly. We defend the truth, one replied. Truth, Severian said evenly, does not require cruelty. They dispersed reluctantly. The priest looked at Severian with tired gratitude. You see, the old man said softly, how it begins. Yes, Severian replied. He walked on, unsettled. The Christians were not wrong to defend their creed, but zeal, once coupled with security, sharpened quickly. Days later, a rumor spread that certain pagan sacrifices would no longer receive municipal funding. The governor denied it publicly, yet the anxiety persisted. Patrons hesitated. Offerings diminished slightly. No decree had outlawed the temples, yet favor redirected attention. Severian visited Diotima. She had completed a draft of her new treatise. She read aloud a passage comparing Platonic participation in the good with the Christian notion of sharing in divine life through Christ. It is not capitulation, she insisted. No, Severian agreed. It is translation. She looked at him carefully. And do you believe translation preserves integrity? Sometimes, he said. Sometimes it alters meaning. She closed the scroll gently. We are all altering, she murmured. Outside her window, children ran through the street, singing a hymn they had learned in church. Their voices were bright, unself-conscious. Diotima watched them. They will not remember the old festivals, she said. No, Severian replied. And you, I will remember, he said. The interior crisis deepened. He felt admiration for the coherence Christianity offered. He felt sorrow for the plurality fading into custom. He felt concern for the administrative use of creed. He felt respect for bishops who spoke sincerely of fidelity. He was no longer asking whether Christianity was inferior. He was asking whether any civilization could endure without narrowing. One morning, Julius appeared again at his door. You are requested, Julius said. By whom? By the emperor. Severian's breath slowed. On what matter? On the matter of further consolidation. The word carried weight. Severian nodded. As Julius departed, Severian stood alone in the quiet room. Further consolidation. The hinge was still turning. He understood now that Nicaea had not been an endpoint. It had been a beginning. Civilization was not merely confessing. It was reorganizing. And he, whether he wished it or not, stood inside the reorganization. He closed his eyes briefly. Is Christianity spiritually inevitable? Perhaps not by divine decree, but by historical convergence. The empire had been searching for cohesion. It had found it in a creed. Whether that cohesion would harden into oppression remained uncertain. Severian opened his eyes. He would meet the emperor again, not to praise, not to condemn, but to witness. And witnessing, he knew, was a burden heavier than argument. The imperial audience chamber was cooler than the streets, shaded by thick stone and disciplined architecture. Severian had stood there once before, though not alone. Now he was admitted with fewer intermediaries. The guard at the entrance examined him briefly, then stepped aside. No herald announced him. The atmosphere was efficient, stripped of excess. Constantine stood near a long table strewn with documents. He was not seated on a throne. He was reading. When Severian entered, the emperor looked up without impatience. "You have returned from Nicaea," Constantine said. "Yes, Augustus. And you have observed." "I have." Constantine gestured toward a bench. "Sit," he said. "Speak freely." The invitation was measured, but genuine. Severian sat. "The creed has begun to circulate," Constantine continued. "Resistance persists in some regions. It will fade." Severian did not challenge the confidence. "It may diminish," he said. "It will not vanish." Constantine's gaze sharpened. "You believe the dispute will endure." "I believe conviction rarely dissolves under decree," Severian replied. The emperor studied him. "You think I have erred?" Severian weighed the answer. "I think you have acted decisively," he said. "Whether the action strengthens unity or forces silence remains to be seen." "You speak as if unity were optional," he said. "In matters of belief," Severian answered quietly. "Unity is rarely immediate." Constantine moved toward the window, overlooking the courtyard. "You are a philosopher," he said. "You value multiplicity of thought. I value coherence," Severian corrected gently, "but not at the expense of integrity." Constantine turned back. "And what is integrity in an empire?" he asked, "if not order?" Severian felt the weight of the moment. "Order," he said slowly, "is stability. Integrity is truthfulness. They are not always identical." Constantine's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in concentration. "You suggest that by enforcing doctrine, I risk dishonesty." "I suggest," Severian replied, "that belief compelled externally may not reflect belief internally." Constantine walked closer. "You have seen division," he said. "You have heard the arguments. Do you think the empire can afford religious chaos?" Severian did not hesitate. "No." "Then what would you have me do?" The question hung between them. Severian understood that this was not a rhetorical challenge. It was a genuine inquiry from a ruler balancing spiritual conviction with administrative necessity. "You have chosen Christianity," Severian said. "That is clear. You believe it offers cohesion. If so, let cohesion grow from persuasion, not fear." Constantine's expression shifted slightly. "You assume fear motivates me." "I assume fear motivates governance," Severian replied. The emperor smiled faintly. "You are not wrong." Silence. Then Constantine spoke more quietly. "I saw something," he said. Severian's pulse quickened. "In the sky," Constantine continued, "before battle. I will not debate whether it was vision or imagination, but it changed me." Severian listened carefully. "I believed," Constantine said, "that the Christian God favored me. Victory followed. Would you have me ignore that?" "No," Severian said honestly. "Then understand this," Constantine continued. "I do not defend this creed merely for politics. I defend it because I believe it true." Severian felt a subtle shift within himself. This was not pure calculation. This was conviction, braided with authority. "And yet," Severian said carefully, "truth defended by power becomes entangled with power's imperfections." Constantine did not deny it. "Every law," he said, "is imperfectly executed." "Yes, every empire," Constantine continued, "imperfectly governed." "Yes, and yet we govern." Severian inclined his head. "Yes." Constantine walked back to the table and picked up a document. "There are temples," he said. "There are rites older than my throne. I have not destroyed them." "No, but I will not fund them equally with churches," Constantine added. Severian felt the statement like a stone placed deliberately. "Favor shapes loyalty," the emperor said. "Yes," Severian replied. "You see the logic. I see the consequence." Constantine set the document down. "Tell me plainly," he said, "is Christianity philosophically inferior?" The question struck Severian directly. "No," he said. Constantine studied him. "It is rigorous," Severian continued. "It addresses unity and multiplicity, transcendence and immanence in a coherent system. It is not naive. Constantine nodded once. And spiritually. It answers the century's anxiety, Severian said. It promises mediation between human fragility and divine permanence. It offers belonging. Constantine's eyes softened slightly. And yet, you hesitate. Yes. Why? Because Severian said, any religion allied too closely with power risks confusing faith with obedience. Constantine exhaled slowly. You fear corruption. I fear certainty without humility. The emperor moved again to the window. Humility, he said. It is a Christian virtue. It must remain so, Severian replied. Constantine turned back. You walk between worlds, he observed. Yes, and you refuse to kneel entirely in either. Severian held his gaze. I kneel to truth, he said. Constantine did not laugh. Truth, the emperor murmured. Every faction at Nicaea claimed it. Yes, and I chose. Yes. Constantine approached him again. You think this is a civilization shift? It is. And you stand at its hinge. So it seems. Constantine regarded him with something like respect. Then remain there, he said. Advise without hostility. Critique without sabotage. If Christianity must grow with an empire, it will require voices that remember what empire forgets. Severian felt the weight of the charge. I will speak honestly, he said. That is all I ask, Constantine replied. A pause. Then, unexpectedly, the emperor added, Do you believe the old gods are dying? Severian considered the question carefully. No, he said at last. They are retreating into memory. Constantine nodded slowly. Memory, he said, is powerful. Yes, but not sovereign, Constantine replied. The statement was not boastful. It was declarative. Severian rose. The audience had ended. As he stepped out of the chamber, he felt the hinge turning again. Christianity was no longer marginal. It was policy. It was protection. It was preference. Yet it was also, undeniably, conviction. The empire had not merely adopted a religion. It had entwined itself with one. Whether that entwinement would produce strength or strangulation remained uncertain. Severian walked back into the sunlight. He no longer asked whether Christianity was inferior. He no longer asked whether it was inevitable. He asked only whether it could remain spiritually alive while becoming politically indispensable. And that, he knew, was a question no council could settle. After the audience, Severian found that his name traveled more quickly than he preferred. He had not declared allegiance. He had not denounced the creed, yet word spread that he had spoken privately with Constantine. That alone altered how men regarded him. Christians approached him with cautious warmth, pagans with wary curiosity, officials with new attentiveness. He had not changed position. The world had changed position around him. Autumn came early that year. The heat broke, and with it some of the open agitation in the streets. But tension did not dissolve. It settled inward. In the lecture hall, Severian resumed his teaching. Attendance had dipped after Nicaea, then slowly returned. Students sat straighter now, aware that words carried weight beyond intellectual exercise. One afternoon he began a discourse on the nature of unity. Consider, he said, that unity can be numerical or organic. Numerical unity erases distinction. Organic unity binds distinction without destroying it. The room was very still. A young student raised his hand. Is that not what the Christians claim? The student asked. About their God. Severian did not evade. It resembles it, he said. Murmurs passed through the benches. And do you agree? Another asked. I agree, Severian replied carefully. That unity without distinction is emptiness, and distinction without unity is chaos. A few students glanced at one another. They understood the reference. After the lecture, Alien waited for him outside. You are careful, Alien said. I must be. You speak as if Christianity has refined your metaphors, or as if it has forced clarity, Severian answered. They walked slowly through the colonnade. Some of our colleagues have left, Alien said quietly. Where? Antioch, Torn, Athens, places where imperial scrutiny is lighter. Severian felt a flicker of grief. And you? I remain, Alien said, for now. They reached the steps and paused. I heard, Alien added, that a temple in a nearby town has been closed. Closed, Severian repeated, funding withdrawn. The roof collapsed. No repairs authorized. Severian closed his eyes briefly. There had been no proclamation forbidding sacrifice. Yet neglect can achieve what decree avoids. Civilization does not always destroy, Severian murmured. Sometimes it starves. Alien gave him a sharp look. You grow more severe in your assessments. I grow more realistic. They parted without further argument. That evening, Severian visited Leontius again. The merchant greeted him with visible fatigue. There have been letters, Leontius said, from bishops in the East, urging stricter enforcement of the creed. And some speak of suppressing pagan rites entirely. Severian felt a chill. And you? I oppose it, Leontius said. We gain strength by endurance, not by suppression. Severian studied him. You understand the danger? Yes. Then speak, Severian urged. Leontius nodded. I will. As Severian left, he realized that the struggle was no longer between pagan and Christian alone. It was within Christianity itself. How far would it lean into power? How tightly would it bind dissent? He sensed that the next stage would not be dramatic. It would be administrative. Edicts framed as reforms, privileges framed as incentives, temples gradually underfunded, clergy gradually elevated, and beneath it all, the quiet reshaping of loyalty. Weeks later, Severian attended a small gathering at Osius's request. The bishop looked older than he had at Nicaea. There are pressures, Osius said without preamble, from those who believe we must purge error swiftly. Severian nodded. And you? I counsel patience, Osius said. But zeal has momentum. Severian felt a weight settle. You risk losing control of the very unity you sought, he said. Osius's eyes reflected exhaustion. I know. Then why not restrain it? Because Osius replied. Some believe restraint betrays conviction. Silence. Severian spoke carefully. Conviction without charity becomes tyranny. Osius did not argue. Pray for us, the bishop said quietly. The request startled Severian. I am not Christian. You understand us, Osius replied. That may be enough. Severian walked home under a sky streaked with fading light. He felt the interior crisis sharpen once more. Christianity had not revealed itself as inferior. It had revealed itself as potent. Its potency lay not merely in doctrine, but in structure. Networked congregations, unified creed, imperial favor, and now, emerging ambition. He could not condemn it wholesale. He could not embrace it uncritically. He stood again between admiration and warning. One morning, news arrived that Constantine had ordered the construction of a grand church in a prominent city, replacing an older shrine. The symbolism was unmistakable. Civilization was not merely shifting. It was being re-inscribed. Severian visited the site. The old stones lay in piles. Workers moved efficiently. No one wept. Yet Severian felt as if he were watching memory dismantled. A child ran past him, laughing, oblivious to the transformation. Perhaps that was the truth. Civilizations do not end in universal lament. They transition amid ordinary life. He turned away from the rubble and looked toward the rising framework of the new church. It would stand for generations. Children would grow within its walls, never having known the shrine that preceded it. He felt no rage, only gravity. The hinge was nearly fully turned. The empire no longer experimented with Christianity. It built with it, and Severian understood with quiet finality that whatever the future held, the old plurality would never again occupy the center. He exhaled slowly. The question had changed, not whether Christianity would dominate, but what kind of Christianity would dominate, and whether any philosopher could still temper its ascent. Winter arrived with a hard wind off the sea. Nicomedia felt narrower in the cold. Doors closed quickly. Conversations shrank to interiors. The new church, whose foundations Severian had watched rise, now stood roofed in white against the gray sky. Its entrance faced the main road deliberately. No one mistook its placement for coincidence. The old shrine stones had been carted away. Severian walked past the church one morning and paused. A small crowd gathered at the door, cloaks drawn tight, breath visible in pale clouds. They entered in twos and threes, not furtively, as Christians once had, but openly. Their confidence was no longer defiant. It was assumed. He did not enter. Instead, he continued toward the lecture hall, where attendance had thinned again. Inside, only a handful of students waited. One of them, Calvus, rose awkwardly. Some have chosen other studies, he said quietly. Other studies, Severian repeated. Theology, Calvus admitted. Severian nodded once. Then they pursue what they believe urgent. Calvus hesitated. Do you resent it? Severian felt the question deeply. No, he said at last. I regret the narrowing. He began the lecture without further comment. They discussed the nature of law, not Roman law and its codes and precedents, but law as principle. What is law? A command, a structure, a declaration of values. Law shapes behavior, Severian said. But it also shapes imagination. What a society codifies, it teaches. The students listened intently. And if a society codifies belief, Calvus ventured, does it shape thought? Yes, Severian replied. Profoundly. After the lecture, he found a sealed message waiting at his door. It was from Aelian. Meet tonight, Dautuatum. No explanation. They met at the old merchant's house, where once they had debated strategy under lamplight. Now only 3 others attended. Diotima, Calvus, and Maternus. Aelian looked drawn. There has been an edict, he said without greeting. Severian's stomach tightened. Against certain forms of divination, Aelian said. Private rites deemed subversive, and warnings against public sacrifice that disturbs Christian assemblies. Severian closed his eyes briefly. The language would be framed as public order. Always public order. Is it enforced? Diotima asked. Not yet broadly, Aelian said, but the message is clear. Maternus leaned heavily on the table. It begins softly, he murmured. Severian felt the hinge grinding now. Christianity, once persecuted for secrecy, now cast suspicion on other secrets. The irony did not escape him. What do you propose? Calvus asked. Aelian looked at Severian. You have counseled survival, Aelian said. What does survival require now? Severian felt the weight of their eyes. Restraint, he said first. Aelian's mouth tightened. And dignity. Diotima spoke quietly. You mean we do not provoke? Yes, Severian said. But neither do we disappear. Maternus nodded slowly. Public philosophy, he said. Yes, Severian replied. Not in opposition to the creed, but in defense of thought. Aelian gave a bitter laugh. And you believe they will tolerate it? They have so far, Severian said. For now, Aelian countered. Severian did not deny it. The room grew still. Outside, wind pressed against the shutters. At last, Diotima spoke. Perhaps, she said softly. The old gods do not require defense. Aelian looked at her sharply. You concede? No, she replied calmly. I release. Severian felt the quiet truth in her words. Release. The temples might fade, the rites might diminish, but the philosophical insight into unity, participation, assent, these could migrate. Migration was not annihilation. Aelian paced once more, then stopped. Tell me honestly, he said to Severian, do you believe Christianity will dominate the empire entirely? Severian did not answer immediately. He thought of Constantine's measured conviction, of Ossius's exhaustion, of Leontius's caution, of young men shouting in markets, of exiles leaving quietly, of temples neglected rather than destroyed. Yes, he said at last. It will dominate. Silence and philosophy, Aelian pressed. Will adapt, Severian replied. And the old plurality, it will survive in fragments. Aelian's shoulders sagged slightly. Fragments, he echoed. Severian stepped closer. You mistake dominance for finality, he said. History continues. Aelian looked at him with a mixture of frustration and reluctant respect. You are less attached than I am, he said. No, Severian answered softly. I am grieving differently. The room fell quiet again. Maternus rose slowly. I am old, he said. I have seen gods rise and emperors fall. What endures is not cult, but conscience. He left without further comment. The others followed shortly after. Severian remained alone in the lamplit room. He felt the full weight of the civilization shift now, not an explosion. A recalibration. The empire had found in Christianity a language of moral unity, a network of loyalty, a narrative of salvation that fit its anxiety. It had woven that language into governance. The old world had not been shattered. It had been absorbed and sidelined. He stepped outside into the freezing air. Across the city, bells rang from the new church. They did not drown out all other sounds, but they claimed the hour. Severian looked up at the night sky. The stars remained indifferent. He felt neither triumph nor despair, only the sober recognition that he was witnessing not the end of thought, but its transformation, Civilization had shifted its center, and those who remembered the former center would carry memory forward like a small guarded flame. He pulled his cloak tighter and walked home through streets that felt both familiar and irrevocably altered. The hinge had nearly completed its arc. Only consequence remained. The consequences did not arrive as catastrophe. They arrived as habit. In the months that followed the edict against certain divinations, Severian noticed a subtle thinning of practices once taken for granted. Fewer public auguries, fewer night rites on the hills beyond the city. Priests still performed sacrifices, but more quietly. Invitations were extended by trusted word rather than open announcement. Meanwhile, Christian processions grew more visible. On feast days, congregations moved through the streets carrying candles even in daylight, singing hymns whose melodies had become familiar. Children walked at the front. Bishops followed in simple robes, yet flanked now by magistrates who treated them with civic respect. No decree proclaimed supremacy. Supremacy accumulated. Severian found himself observing, with a historian's eye, even as he remained a participant in the moment. He began to write more deliberately, recording conversations, noting shifts in tone. One entry read, "Power has not crushed philosophy. It has redirected prestige." Another, "The old gods retreat not under assault, but under indifference." One afternoon, a young Christian deacon requested a private audience. His name was Marcus, earnest and intense. "You have spoken of unity and distinction," Marcus said. "We struggle to explain the creed without dissolving one to the other." Severian regarded him calmly. "You are discovering what philosophers have long known," he said. "Language strains under transcendence." Marcus leaned forward. "Is our formulation flawed?" "No," Severian replied. "It is bold. But boldness invites misreading." Marcus nodded slowly. "There are those," he said, "who say we must silence all ambiguity." Severian felt the old tension rise. "If you silence ambiguity entirely," he said, "you silence thought." Marcus hesitated. "But thought can fracture unity." "Yes," Severian said. "But unity without thought becomes brittle." Marcus absorbed this. "You speak as if you care for our faith." "I care," Severian said, "for any structure that now shapes civilization." Marcus left with gratitude. Severian watched him go and wondered whether he had just strengthened Christianity or tempered it. Perhaps both. Meanwhile, resistance simmered quietly. In a nearby town, a group of pagans protested the removal of state funds from a local shrine. The protest was dispersed peacefully, but 2 organizers were fined heavily. Word traveled fast. Alien confronted Severian that evening. "Peaceful," Alien said sharply. "Always peaceful. Always administrative." Severian did not contest it. "Yes. And you still believe this is not oppression?" "I believe," Severian replied, "it is consolidation." Alien's eyes flashed. "Names matter." "Yes," Severian said, "which is why we must choose them carefully." Alien laughed without humor. "You have become an interpreter for empire." "I have become a witness," Severian corrected. They walked through the colonnade together. "Do you ever wish," Alien asked quietly, "that Constantine had lost that battle?" Severian stopped. The question was dangerous. "Yes," he said at last. "And no." Alien waited. "If he had lost," Severian continued, "another emperor might have risen with different loyalties. The fragmentation would have continued. The anxiety would have deepened. Perhaps another faith would have filled the void." Alien shook his head. "You speak as if history seeks fulfillment." "No," Severian replied. "I speak as if societies seek coherence." They resumed walking. "Christianity provides that," Alien said bitterly. "For now," Severian answered. "And you believe that coherence justifies the narrowing?" "I believe narrowing may be the cost of survival." Alien fell silent. That night, Severian dreamed. He stood in the old temple district. The statues were not shattered. They were veiled, cloth draped over marble faces. Lamps extinguished not by force, but by neglect. Then he turned and saw the new church filled with light. Not harsh light, warm, steady illumination. In the dream he felt neither triumph nor despair, only transition. He woke before dawn. The city was quiet. He walked outside and listened. No bells yet, no sacrifices yet, only the distant murmur of waves against the harbor. He understood then that civilization had already shifted in imagination. Children growing up now would assume one god, one creed, one moral vocabulary. Plurality would become memory. Memory would become curiosity. Curiosity might become nostalgia, but nostalgia rarely governs. Weeks later, another edict arrived. Clergy were granted certain legal privileges. Bishops could adjudicate disputes among Christians without civil interference. The implication was unmistakable: parallel authority. Severian met with Osius once more. "You are building structures," Severian said. "We are organizing care," Osius replied. "And jurisdiction," Severian added. Osius did not deny it. "Would you prefer chaos?" the bishop asked. "No," Severian said. "But I note the transformation." Osius regarded him with weary honesty. "You think we are becoming imperial?" "You are," Severian replied. "And empire is becoming ecclesial." Osius closed his eyes briefly. "Perhaps," he said, "this is providence." "Or convergence," Severian answered. They stood in silence. Severian felt the hinge complete its arc. Christianity was no longer rising. It had risen. The question now was not whether it would dominate. It was how it would wield that dominance. He walked home slowly, aware that he no longer stood merely between worlds. He stood in a new one. And the work of remembering, interpreting, and warning had only begun. Spring returned gently, almost deceptively. Blossoms opened along the roads leading out of Nicomedia. Traders resumed louder bargaining. The harbor filled again with ships carrying grain, wool, olive oil, and news. Always news. Severian noticed that fewer conversations now began with uncertainty about the creed. The language of Nicaea had settled into common speech. Children recited phrases they did not fully understand, but already assumed to be foundational. Of one substance, begotten, not made. The repetition had dulled the shock. What had once been debated in an imperial hall was now catechism. And yet beneath the surface calm, tension had not vanished. It had relocated. Reports arrived from Alexandria of renewed unrest. Arius had supporters still, and some claimed the emperor's earlier severity had been too harsh, others too lenient. The machinery of exile turned quietly, then reversed in certain cases, then turned again. Constantine, ever pragmatic, adjusted. Unity, Severian realized, was not a single decision. It was maintenance. He found himself summoned again, not by Constantine this time, but by a newly appointed bishop in a nearby city who sought counsel on educating converts from pagan households. The bishop was young, earnest, and overwhelmed. "They bring habits with them," the bishop said. "They still speak of household spirits. They fear dreams. They hang charms at their doors." Severian almost smiled. "They have not ceased to be human," he said. "How do we instruct them without humiliating them?" the bishop asked. Severian regarded him carefully. "You must understand what their practice is answered," he said. "Fear of unseen forces, desire for protection, sense of proximity between the divine and daily life." The bishop nodded slowly. "Then Christianity must offer deeper protection," Severian continued. "Not mere prohibition." The bishop looked relieved. "You do not mock us," he said. "No," Severian replied. "I recognize continuity." For that was what he had begun to see clearly. Christianity had not erased the spiritual anxieties gods described in the age of uncertainty. It had absorbed them. Where once men feared demons, now they feared heresy. Where once they sought amulets, now they sought relics. The structure of longing remained. The vocabulary changed. On his journey back to Nicomedia, Severian passed an abandoned shrine by the roadside. Its columns leaned slightly. The paint had faded. No offerings lay at its base. He dismounted and approached it. He placed his hand on the cool stone. "This is how it ends," he murmured. "Not with flames, with forgetting." He did not weep. He did not pray. He simply stood in acknowledgement. That evening he met Aelian once more. The younger philosopher looked older now, lines deepening around his mouth. "Have you noticed," Aelian said, "how quickly the children adapt?" "Yes. They speak of one god as if there were never many." "Yes. And they do not ask about Zeus?" "No." Aelian exhaled. "It is finished." Severian shook his head gently. "It is transformed." Aelian looked at him sharply. "You still cling to nuance." "I cling to accuracy," Severian replied. They sat in silence. After a time, Aelian spoke more quietly. "I attended a Christian gathering," he said. Severian's brow lifted slightly. "To observe," Aelian added quickly. "And?" "They sang," Aelian said. "Not triumphantly, not arrogantly. With conviction." Severian waited. "It unsettled me," Aelian admitted. "They believe history bends toward them. And you do not? Severian asked. Alien hesitated. I do not know anymore. Severian felt a strange tenderness toward his old rival. You once asked, Severian said softly, whether Christianity was spiritually inevitable. Yes, I think now that inevitability is not the right word. Then what? Convergence, Severian said. Empire sought unity. The age sought assurance. Christianity offered both. Alien's eyes narrowed, and philosophy offered ascent, Severian replied. But ascent is solitary. Christianity offers community. Alien looked away. I preferred the solitary climb. I know. They rose together and walked toward the harbor. The city moved around them, less tense than months before. The new church stood not as an intrusion now, but as part of the skyline. Bells rang at appointed hours. Fewer heads turned in irritation. Habit had completed what decree began. As they reached the water's edge, Severian felt an unexpected calm. The hinge had turned. Civilization had confessed its new center. He no longer felt suspended between worlds. He felt positioned within a new one that still required interpretation. Alien broke the silence. Will you convert? He asked quietly. Severian did not answer immediately. He looked at the water, at ships setting sail toward provinces where similar transformations unfolded. I will continue to seek truth, he said at last. That is not an answer. It is the only honest one. Alien studied him. You remain between. Yes, and does that satisfy you? No, Severian admitted. They watched the horizon until the sun began to dip. Severian understood now that the shift of civilization was not a clean exchange of gods. It was a redefinition of belonging. Those who confessed the creed stood at the center. Those who did not stood at the margin. Margin did not mean extinction, but it meant adaptation. He felt neither bitterness nor triumph, only the sober awareness that history had chosen its direction through the choices of men, convinced they were defending truth. As twilight deepened, the bell rang again from the church behind them. It did not silence the sea, but it measured the hour, and the hour, Severian knew, belonged to a new age. The older Severian grew, the less dramatic the shift appeared. That, perhaps, was the strangest revelation. Years earlier, he had expected upheaval to feel like thunder. Instead, it had unfolded like sediment settling in water, grain by grain, until the riverbed itself had changed shape. Constantine's favor of Christianity had once seemed provisional, an experiment in unity. Now it felt embedded. Churches were constructed not tentatively but confidently. Clergy corresponded across provinces with the assurance of institutional permanence. Disputes still erupted, yes, but within an accepted framework. The framework was Christian. One morning, Severian was invited to observe a dispute, brought before a bishop rather than a civil magistrate. Two merchants, both baptized, argued over a debt. Instead of seeking judgment in the forum, they had appealed to ecclesiastical authority. The bishop listened with patient gravity. He cited not Roman statutes, but scriptural exhortations about fairness and reconciliation. He imposed restitution gently, but firmly. The merchants bowed. Outside, one of them muttered, "It is easier this way." Severian felt the tremor beneath the comment. Easier. The state's juridical weight softened by spiritual framing. Parallel authority was no longer theoretical. It functioned. Later that day, Severian walked through the old temple district again. Only one shrine remained active with visible offerings. An elderly priest tended it alone. Severian approached. "You persist," he said quietly. The priest smiled faintly. "I remember." "Is memory enough?" Severian asked. "For some," the priest replied. Severian stood beside him for a long moment. "Do you resent them?" he asked. The priest shook his head. "No, they have found what they believe steadies them. And you?" "I have what steadies me." Severian inclined his head in respect. As he turned to leave, he felt the gravity of that exchange. Civilization had shifted its center, but not every soul had followed in lockstep. He returned home to find a letter waiting from Alien. "I am leaving." No elaboration. He sought Alien immediately. The Inger philosopher's house was half-packed. Scrolls lay stacked in bundles. A few statues wrapped carefully in cloth. "You chose," Severian said. "Yes," Alien replied. "Athens still breathes differently. For now," Severian said. Alien smiled thinly. "Perhaps I am chasing memory." "Perhaps," Severian agreed. They stood facing one another, the weight of shared years between them. "You were right," Alien said quietly. "About what?" "That Christianity was not inferior." Severian felt no satisfaction in the admission. And you were right, Alien added. That power would shape it. Severian nodded. It already has. Alien looked toward the doorway. Will you remain? Yes. Why? Severian considered the question deeply. Because this is where the transformation is most visible, he said. And someone must observe without surrendering entirely. Alien laughed softly. You remain between. Yes. They embraced briefly, awkwardly. As Alien departed, Severian felt a chapter closing. The resistance of proud philosophy was thinning, not extinguished but dispersing. That evening, Severian attended a Christian service for the first time, not as observer, but as participant among many. He did not recite the creed aloud. He listened. The bishop spoke of humility. He warned against triumphalism. He reminded the congregation that power was temptation. Severian listened closely. Afterward, Marcus the deacon approached him. You came, Marcus said. Yes. What did you think? Severian chose honesty. You stand at risk, he said. Marcus frowned slightly. Of what? Of forgetting that you once depended on mercy. Marcus grew thoughtful. We speak of it often. Continue, Severian said. He walked home beneath a sky washed with early stars. He realized that his question had evolved again. It was no longer whether Christianity would dominate. It was whether it could remember its origin. Memory, he had told Constantine, was powerful, but not sovereign. If Christianity forgot the anxiety from which it rose, forgot the humility forged in persecution, forgot the longing for mediation that gave it life, it would harden into mere institution. And institutions, he knew, are fragile in their own way. As he lay awake that night, Severian felt neither despair nor hope in pure form. He felt responsibility, to speak, to interpret, to warn when necessary, to affirm when deserved. Civilization had shifted, yes, but civilization is not static. It continues to become, and within its becoming, voices like his must decide whether to withdraw into nostalgia or remain present in ambiguity. Severian chose presence. The hinge had turned. Now the structure must hold. Years passed. Constantine grew older. The empire shifted its capital. Court and bishops traveled in widening circles. Edicts accumulated, not all severe, not all gentle. Christianity continued its ascent, but no ascent remains pure. Severian felt the weight of time in his joints now. His hair had thinned. His lectures grew quieter, more reflective. Fewer students came seeking metaphysical daring. More came seeking integration. How to reconcile Plato with the gospel, Aristotle with the creed. Philosophy had not died. It had been absorbed. He found himself invited to speak not in pagan halls, but in Christian schools. There, young clerics asked him about substance, essence, participation, causality. The vocabulary had changed. The questions had not. One afternoon Marcus, no longer a deacon but now a presbyter, sat with him beneath the portico of the new church. There are new disputes, Marcus said. There always are, Severian replied. Some argue the emperor should enforce more firmly against pagan rites. Others say we risk resentment. Severian smiled faintly. You're discovering politics. Marcus's expression darkened. We wanted purity, he said, and found governance. Severian answered. Marcus looked at him with earnest intensity. Tell me honestly, he said, have we betrayed our beginning? Severian took a long breath. You have changed, he said carefully, but change is not betrayal by necessity. Marcus waited. When you were persecuted, Severian continued, your humility was unavoidable. Now it must be chosen. Marcus lowered his gaze. That is harder. Yes, they sat in silence. Severian thought of Alien in Athens, of Diotima's careful translations, of temples now nearly empty, of children who knew only the new vocabulary of belonging. He thought, too, of Constantine's confession that he had seen something in the sky and believed it. Whether vision or imagination, it had altered history. Was Christianity spiritually inevitable? Severian no longer believed in inevitability. He believed in convergence, conviction, and opportunity. The empire had been anxious. It had sought unity. Christianity had offered structure, narrative, and belonging. Constantine had offered protection, preference. Together, they had reshaped civilization. But that shaping was not complete. Severian rose and walked alone that evening to the edge of the city, where the abandoned shrine still stood, half collapsed now, ivy claiming its stones. He stood before it once more. This was once central, he murmured. He did not feel grief as sharply as before. He felt distance. The old plurality had receded into memory, into art, into metaphor. He turned and looked back toward the city. Church spires rose above rooftops. Bells marked the hour. Markets bustled under Christian festivals rather than pagan ones. The transformation was not violent in memory. It was thorough. He returned home and opened his journal. He wrote slowly. Civilization has shifted from ritual plurality to confessional unity, from local cult to universal creed, from negotiated tolerance to declared orthodoxy. He paused. Is this loss or evolution? He considered. Both. He continued. Philosophy remains, but in altered dress. The ascent toward the one now articulated as participation in the divine. The language is Christian. The hunger is perennial. He set down the stylus. The interior crisis that had once gnawed at him no longer felt like crisis. It felt like clarity. Christianity was not philosophically inferior. It had drawn deeply from the same well of metaphysical inquiry, even when it denied the source. It was not spiritually inevitable in isolation, but in that age, an age anxious, fractured, longing for assurance, it had been profoundly suited. Severian closed the journal. There remained one final tension. What would happen when a future emperor, less restrained than Constantine, wielded the machinery now constructed? Unity can become coercion. Orthodoxy can become weapon. He could not see that future. He could only warn. The next morning he addressed his students one final time before retiring from regular lectures. Civilizations change, he said calmly. Do not mistake change for apocalypse, but do not mistake dominance for truth either. They listened intently. Christianity now shapes our world, he continued. Engage it seriously. Study it rigorously. Guard it against cruelty. Remember what it promised when it was weak. He paused. And remember, too, that truth is not secured by power alone. A young student asked, and what of the old gods? Severian smiled gently. They live where memory lives, he said. In poetry, in thought, in the questions we still ask. He dismissed them quietly. As he stepped outside, the bell rang again. He no longer felt it as intrusion. He felt it as environment. The hinge had turned long ago. Now he stood not at its pivot, but within its consequence. He had not converted. He had not rebelled. He had witnessed. And perhaps, he thought, that was enough. Constantine was baptized only at the end. The news traveled with a strange, quiet dignity. Not with the frenzy that had followed Nicaea, not with the administrative precision of edicts, but with something softer. The emperor who had favored Christianity for decades had entered it formally only as death approached. Severian received the report with a long, steady breath. So even he had hesitated, or waited, or calculated, or believed that the sacrament, like a final seal, was best applied at the threshold of judgment. No one could know fully, but the gesture mattered. It confirmed what had long been unfolding. Christianity was no longer merely protected. It was imperial. Yet even in that final act, Severian sensed the human fragility beneath policy. Constantine, conqueror and consolidator, had faced mortality as every man does. The creed he had elevated became, in the end, his own confession. The empire continued. It always does. But something in Severian felt complete. He walked once more to the edge of the city where the abandoned shrine stood in near ruin. Ivy now covered most of its columns. Rain had eroded the carved faces of gods that once seemed eternal. He did not mourn. He did not rejoice. He stood in acknowledgement. Civilizations are not replaced like furniture. They are layered. The new does not entirely erase the old. It reinterprets it, absorbs it, sometimes denies it, sometimes unknowingly carries it forward. He turned and looked toward the city. Churches marked the skyline. Bells measured time. Children recited creeds. Bishops adjudicated disputes. The vocabulary of sin, salvation, orthodoxy, and heresy had become civic language. The old plurality had retreated to the margins, into memory, into metaphor. Yet, philosophy persisted. In Christian schools, young minds wrestled with substance and essence. They quoted Plato even when they named Christ. They spoke of participation in divine life using categories forged in pagan halls. Truth had migrated, not vanished. Severian walked back through the streets slowly, leaning now more heavily on his staff. He passed the harbor where he had once debated with Aelian. Ships still came and went. Trade continued. Ordinary life had not collapsed under theological shift. That, perhaps, was the most sobering truth. History's hinges feel immense to those who stand within them. To those born after, they feel inevitable. Was Christianity philosophically inferior? No, Beato. It had proven capable of conceptual depth, willing to engage the hardest metaphysical questions. It had absorbed and transformed the language of substance and unity. Was it spiritually inevitable? No, but it had been historically apt. The age had been anxious, fractured, haunted by unseen forces, and longing for coherence. Christianity offered mediation, community, and moral clarity. The convergence reshaped civilization. Severian reached his home and entered quietly. He sat at his desk and opened his journal one final time. He wrote, "I have lived through a civilization shift, not through fire, but through definition, not through conquest alone, but through conviction allied with authority." He paused. "What have I learned?" he continued. "That philosophical superiority is irrelevant if it does not answer the century's hunger. That spiritual vitality risks corruption when married to power. That unity brings strength and narrows imagination. That plurality preserves ambiguity and invites fragmentation." He set the stylus down. He felt no triumph in his neutrality. He had not remained untouched. Christian vocabulary had entered his thinking. He spoke now of humility with new weight. He understood community differently than in his youth. He no longer believed assent was sufficient without dissent. In that sense, he too had shifted, not converted, but altered. He stepped outside into the fading light. A procession moved down the street, modest but confident. A hymn rose, steady and unforced. No soldiers accompanied it. No decree compelled it. Habit had replaced tension. The empire had confessed. He watched as children carried candles, their faces calm. They would grow into a world where Christianity was not contested novelty, but inherited reality. They would not feel the hinge turning. They would live within its consequence. Severian felt a quiet peace settle in him. He had asked whether Christianity was inferior or inevitable. He now understood that history rarely answers such questions cleanly. Civilizations move where conviction and opportunity meet. The old gods had faded into memory, but memory remained a teacher. The new faith had risen to dominance, but dominance carried burden. And philosophers, even in new dress, would continue to ask difficult questions. The bell rang, not as intrusion, not as triumph, as measure. Severian closed his eyes and listened. Civilization had shifted. He had witnessed. That was enough.